Chapter 17 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fight in the Study. Eaton dismissed the man who had been waiting in his rooms for him. He locked the door and carefully drew down all the window shades. Then he put his overcoat, folded as he had been carrying it under his arm, on the writing table in the center of the room, and from its folds and pockets took a breast drill such as ironworkers use in drilling steel, an automatic pistol with 3 clips of cartridges, an electric flashlight, and a little bottle of nitroglycerin. He loaded the pistol and put it in his pocket. Then he carefully inspected the other things. The room he was in, the largest of his suite, resembled Santoine's study on the floor below in the arrangement of its windows, though it was smaller than the study. The writing desk in its center occupied much the position of Santoine's large desk. He moved it slightly to make their relative positions coincide. The couch against the end wall represented the position of the study's double doors. Eaton switched out the lights, and, starting at the windows, he crossed the room in the darkness, avoiding the desk, and stopping a few feet to the right of the couch. Here he flashed his light upon the wall at the height of the little wall safe to the right of the doors in the study below. A dozen times he did this, passing from the windows to the position of the wall safe, and only momentarily flashing his light. He reassured himself thus of being able to pass in the dark from the windows of Santoine's study to the wall safe. As the study was larger than this room, he computed that he must add 2 steps to what he took here in each direction. He paid no attention to the position of the safe to the left of the doors, for he had kept watch of the vase on the table in the lower hall, and the only sign he had found there had told him that what he wanted was in the safe to the right. He raised a shade and window, then, and sat in the dark. The night was cloudy and very dark, and the lake was smooth with barely a ripple. Near at hand a steamer passed, blazing with lights, and further out he saw the masthead light of some other steamer. The lake was still ice-locked at its northern end, and so the farther of these steamers, he knew, was bound to some southern Michigan port. The nearer was one of the Chicago-Milwaukee boats. For some moments after it had passed, the waves of its wake washed in and sounded on the shore at the foot of the bluff. Next, Eaton made out the hum of a motor car approaching the house. It was Avery, who evidently had been out and was now returning. The chauffeur spoke the name in his reply to some question as the car swung away to the garage. Eaton still sat in the dark. By degrees all noises ceased in the house, even in the servants' quarters. Twice Eaton leaned forward, looking out of the window, and found all quiet, but both times he settled back in his chair and waited. The wash of waves, as from a passing boat, sounded again on the shore. Eaton leaned nearer the window and stared out. There was no light in sight showing any boat, but the waves on the shore were distinct. Indeed, they had been more distinct than those from the steamer. They must have been made by a large vessel, or from a small ship close in and moving fast. The waves came in first on the north and swept south. Eaton strained his eyes and now saw a vague blur off to the south and within half a mile of shore. A boat without lights. If it had passed at high speed, it had stopped now. He watched this for some time, but he could make out no more, and soon he could not be sure even that the blur was there. He gazed at the south wing of the house. It was absolutely dark and quiet. The windows of the first floor were closed and the curtains drawn, but tonight there was no light in the room. The windows of the room on the second floor were open. Basil Santoine was undoubtedly asleep. Eaton gazed again at the lower room. Then, in the dark, he moved to the table where he had left his overcoat and distributed in his pockets and within his clothing the articles he had brought, And now he felt again in the overcoat and brought out a short, strong bar of steel, curved and flattened at one end. A jimmy for forcing the windows. Eaton slipped off his shoes and went to his room door. He opened the door and found the hall dark and quiet. He stepped out, closing his door carefully behind him, and with great caution he descended the stairs. Below all was quiet. The red embers of the glowing charcoal of wood fires which had blazed on the hearths gave the only light. Eaton crept to the doors of the blind man's study and softly tried them. They were, as he had expected, locked. He went to a window in the drawing room, which was set in a recess and so placed that it was not visible from other windows in the house. He opened this window and let himself down upon the lawn. There he stood still for a moment, listening. There was no alarm of any sort. He crept along beside the house till he came to the first windows of the south wing. He tried these carefully and then went on. He gained the south corner of the wing, unobserved, or at least without sign that he had been seen, and went on around it. He stopped at the first high French window on the south. It was partly hidden from view from south and west by a column of the portico, and was the one he had selected for his operations. As he tried to slip his jimmy under the bottom of the sash, the window, to his amazement, opened silently upon its hinges. It had not been locked. The heavy curtains within hung just in front of him. He put out his hand and parted them. Then he started back in astonishment and crouched close to the ground. Inside the room was a man moving about, flashing an electric torch before him, and then exploring an instant in darkness and flashing his torch again. The unexpectedness of this sight took for an instant Eaton's breath and power of moving. He had not been at all prepared for this. Now he knew suddenly that he ought to have been prepared for it. If the man within the room was not the one who had attacked him with the motor, he was closely allied with that man, and what he was after now was the same thing Eaton was after. Eaton looked about behind him. No one, apparently, had been left on watch outside. He drew his pistol, and, loosing the safety, he made it ready to fire. With his left hand he clung to the short, heavy jimmy. He stepped into the great room through the curtains, taking care they did not jingle the rings from which they hung. He carefully let the curtains fall together behind him, and, treading noiselessly in his stocking feet, he advanced upon the man, moving forward in each period of darkness between flashes of the electric torch. The man, continuing to flash his light about, plainly had heard nothing, and the curtains had prevented him from being warned by the chill of the night air that the window was open. But now, at the further side of the room, another electric torch flashed out. Another man had been in the room. He neither alarmed nor was alarmed by the man flashing the first light. Each had known the other's presence before. There were at least two men in the room, working together, or rather, one was working, the other supervising, for Eaton heard now a steady, almost inaudible grinding noise as the second man worked. Eaton halted again and waited. If there were two, there might be others. The discovery of the second man had not made Eaton afraid. His pulses were beating faster and hotter, and he felt the blood rushing to his head and his hands growing cold with his excitement. But he was conscious of no fear. He crouched and crept forward noiselessly again. No other light appeared in the room, and there was no sound elsewhere from the darkness. But the man who supervised had moved closer to the other. The grinding noise had stopped. It was followed by a sharp click. The men, side by side, were bending over something, and the light of the man who had been working for a fraction of a second shot into the face of the other. It did not delay at all. It was purely accidental flash, and could not have been said to show the features at all, only a posture, an expression, a personality of a strong and cruel man. He muttered some short, hoarse imprecation at the other, but before Eaton heard the voice, he had stopped as if struck, and his breath had gone from him. His instant's glimpse of that face astounded, stunned, stupefied him. He could not have seen that man. The fact was impossible. He must have been mad. His mind must have become unreliable to let him even imagine it. Then came the sound of the voice of the man whose face he had seen. It was he, and, in place of the paralysis of the first instant, now a wild, savage throe of passion seized Eaton. His pulses leaped so it seemed they must burst his veins, and he gulped and choked. He had not filled in with insane fancy the features of the man whom he had seen. The voice witnessed, too, that the man in the dark by the wall was he whom Eaton, if he could have dreamed such a fact as now had been disclosed, would have circled the world to catch and destroy. Yet now, with the destruction of that man in his power, for he had but to aim and empty his automatic pistol at 5 paces, such destruction at this moment could not suffice. Mere shooting that man would be petty, ineffectual. Eaton's fingers tightened on the handle of his pistol, but he held it now not as a weapon to fire, but as a dull weight with which to strike. The grip of his left hand clamped onto the short steel bar, and with lips parted, breathing once, it seemed, for each heartbeat, and yet choking, suffocating, he leaped forward. At the same instant, so that he could not have been alarmed by Eaton's leap, the man who had been working moved his torch, and the light fell upon Eaton. "Look out!" the man cried in alarm to his companion. With the word, the light of the torch vanished. The man toward whom Eaton rushed did not have time to switch off his light. He dropped it instead, and as Eaton sprang for him, he crouched. Eaton, as he struck forward, found nothing, but below his knees Eaton felt a man's powerful arms tackling him. As he struggled to free himself, a swift, savage lunge lifted him from his feet. He was thrown and hurled backwards. Eaton ducked his head forward and struggled to turn as he went down so that a shoulder, and not his head or back, would strike the floor first. He succeeded in this, though in his effort he dropped the jimmy. He clung with his right hand to the pistol, and as he struck the floor the pistol shot off. The flash of flame spurted toward the ceiling. Instantly the grip below his knees was loosed. The man who had tackled him and hurled him back had recoiled in the darkness. Eaton got to his feet, but crouched and crept about behind a table, aiming his pistol over it in the direction in which he supposed the other man must be. The sound of the shot had ceased to roar through the room. The gases from the powder only made the air heavier. The other 2 men in the room also waited, invisible and silent. The only light in the great curtained room came from the single electric torch lying on the floor. This lighted the legs of a chair, a corner of a desk, and a circle of books in the cases on the wall. As Eaton's eyes became more accustomed to the darkness, he could see vague shapes of furniture. If a man moved, he might be made out, but if he stayed still, probably he would remain indistinguishable. The other men seemed also to have recognized this. No one moved in the room, and there was complete silence. Eaton knelt on one knee behind his table. Now he was wildly, exultantly excited. His blood leaped hotly to his hand pointing his pistol. He panted, almost audibly, for breath. But though his pulse throbbed through his head, too, his mind was clear and cool as he reckoned his situation and his chances. He had crossed the Pacific, the continent. He had schemed and risked everything with mere hope of getting into this room to discover evidence with which to demand from the world writing of the wrong which had driven him as a fugitive for 5 years, and here he found the man who was the cause of it all before him in the same room a few paces away in the dark. For it was impossible that this was not the man, and Eaton knew now that this was he who must have been behind and arranging and directing the attacks upon him. Eaton had not only seen him and heard his voice, but he had felt his grasp, that sudden instinctive crouch before a charge, and the savage lunge and tackle were the instant, natural acts of an old linesman on a championship team in the game of football as it was played 20 years before. That lift of the opponent off his feet and the heavy lunge hurling him back to fall on his head was what one man, in the rougher, more cruel days of the college game, had been famous for. On the football field, that throw sufficed to knock a helmeted opponent unconscious. Here it was meant, beyond doubt, to do more. Upon so much, at least, Eaton's mind at once was clear. Here was his enemy whom he must destroy if he himself were not first destroyed. Other thoughts, recasting of other relations, altered or overturned in their bearing by the discovery of this man here. Everything else could and must wait upon the mighty demand of that moment, upon Eaton to destroy this enemy now or be himself destroyed. Eaton shook in his passion, yet coolly he now realized that his left shoulder, which had taken the shock of his fall, was numb. He shifted his pistol to cover a vague form which had seemed to move, but, if it had stirred, it was still again now. Eaton strained to listen. It seemed certain that the noise of the shot, if not the sound of the struggle which preceded it, must have raised an alarm, though the room was in a wing and shut off by double doors from the main part of the house. It was possible that the noise had not gone far, but it must have been heard in the room directly above and connected with the study by a staircase at the head of which was a door. Basil Santoyne, as Eaton knew, slept above. A nurse must be waiting on duty somewhere near. Eaton had seen the row of buttons which the blind man had within arm's length, with which he must be able to summon every servant in the house. So it could not last much longer now. This deadlock in the dark, the two facing one, and none of them daring to move. And one of the two, at least, seemed to have recognized that. Eaton had moved, warily and carefully, but he had moved. A revolver flashed before him. Instantly, and without consciousness that his finger pulled the trigger, Eaton's pistol flashed back. In front of him the flame flashed again, and another spurt of fire spat at one side. Eaton fired back at this. He was prostrate on the floor now, and whether he had been hit or not he did not yet know, or whether the blood flowing down his face was only from a splinter sprayed from the table behind which he had hid. He fired again, holding his pistol far out to one side to confuse the aim of the others. He thought that they too were doing the same, and allowed for it in his aim. He pulled his trigger a 9th time. He had not counted his shots, but he knew he had had 7 cartridges in the magazine and 1 in the barrel, and the pistol clicked without discharging. He rolled over further away from the spot where he had last fired and pulled an extra clip of cartridges from his pocket. The blood was flowing hot over his face. He made no effort to staunch it, or even to feel with his fingers to find exactly where or how badly he had been hit. He jerked the empty cartridge clip from his pistol butt and snapped in the other. He swept his sleeve over his face to clear the blood from his brows and eyes, and stared through the dark with pistol at arm's length loaded and ready. Blood spurted over his face again. Another sweep of his sleeve cleared it, and he moved his pistol point back and forth in the dark. The flash of the firing from the other 2 revolvers had stopped. The roar of the shots had ceased to deafen. Eaton had not counted the shots at him any better than he had kept track of his own firing, but he knew now that the other 2 must have emptied their magazines as well as he. It was possible, of course, that he had killed one of them or wounded one mortally, but he had no way to know that. He could hear the click as one of the men snapped his revolver shut again after reloading. Then another click came. Both the others had reloaded. "All right?" The voice which Eaton knew questioned the other. "All right," came the reply. But if they were all right, they made no offer to fire first again. Nor yet did they dare to move. Eaton knew they lay on the floor like himself. They lay with fingers on trigger, as he also lay, waiting again for him to move so they could shoot at him. But surely now the sound of the firing in that room must have reached the man in the room above. Surely he must be summoning his servants. Eaton listened. There was still no sound from the rest of the house. But overhead now he heard an almost imperceptible pattering, the sound of a bare-footed man crossing the floor, and he knew that the blind man in the bedroom above was getting up. End of chapter 17. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 18 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under Cover of Darkness. Basil Santoine was oversensitive to sound, as are most of the blind. In the world of darkness in which he lived, sounds were by far the most significant, and almost the only, means he had of telling what went on around him. He passed his life in listening for or determining the nature of sounds. So the struggle which ended in Eaton's crash to the floor would have waked him without the pistol shot immediately following. That roused him wide awake immediately and brought him sitting up in bed, forgetful of his own condition. Santoine at once recognized the sound as a shot, but in the instant of waking he had not been able to place it more definitely than to know that it was close. His hand went at once to the bell-board, and he rang at the same time for the nurse outside his door and for the steward. But for a few moments after that first shot, nothing followed. There was silence. Santoine was not one of those who doubt their hearing. That was the sense in which the circumstances of his life made him implicitly trust. He had heard a shot nearby. The fact that nothing more followed did not make him doubt it. It made him think to explain it. It was plain that no one else in the house had been stirred by it, for his windows were open and other windows in bedrooms in the main part of the house were open. No one had raised any cry of alarm. So the shot was where he alone had heard it. That meant indoors, in the room below. Santoine pressed the bells quickly again and sat up straighter and more strained. No one, breaking into the house for plate or jewelry, would enter through that room. He would have to break through double doors to reach any other part of the house. Santoine did not consider the possibility of robbery of that sort long enough to have been said to consider it at all. What he felt was that the threat which had been hanging vaguely over himself ever since Warden's murder was being fulfilled. But it was not Santoine himself that was being attacked. It was something Santoine possessed. There was only one sort of valuable article for which one might enter that room below, and those articles— The blind man clenched his jaw and pressed the bells to call all the men-servants in the house, and Avery also, but still he got no response. A shot in the room below meant, of course, that in addition to the intruder there must be a defender. The defender might have been the one who fired, or the one who was killed. For it seemed likely, in the complete silence now, that whoever had fired had disposed of his adversary and was undisturbed. At that moment the second shot, the first fired at Eaton, rang out below. Eaton's return fire followed nearly simultaneously, and then the shot of the third man. These explosions and the next three the blind man in bed above was able to distinguish. There were 3 men, at least, in the room below firing at each other. Then, as the automatic revolvers roared on, he no longer could separate attack and reply. There might be 3 men, there might be a half a dozen. The fusillade of the automatics overlapped. It was incessant. Then, all at once, the firing stopped. There was no sound or movement of any sort. Everything seemed absolutely still below. The blind man pressed and pressed the buttons on his bell-board. Any further alarm, after the firing below, seemed superfluous. But his wing of the house had been built for him proof against sound in the main portion of the building. The house, therefore, was deadened to noise within the wing. Santoin, accustomed to considering the manner in which sounds came to himself, knew how these sounds would come to others. Coming from the open windows of the wing and entering the open windows of the other parts of the house, they would not appear to the household to come from within the house at all. They would appear to come from some part of the grounds or from the beach. Yet someone or more than one from his house must be below or have been there. Santoin pressed all the bells again and then got up. He had heard absolutely no sound outside, as must be made by anyone escaping from the room below. But the battle seemed over. One side must have destroyed the other. From the character of the fighting, it was most probable that someone had secretly entered the room. Santoin thought of that one definitely now as the man he was entertaining as Eaton. A servant or someone else from the house had surprised him in the room and was shot. Other servants, roused by the alarm, rushed in and were shot. Santoin counted that, if his servants had survived, one of them must be coming to tell him what had happened. But there was no noise now, nor any movement at all below. His side had been beaten, or both sides had ceased to exist. Those alternatives alone occurred to the blind man. The number of shots fired within the confines of the room below precluded any other explanation. He did not imagine the fact that the battle had been fought in the dark. Himself perpetually in the dark, he thought of others always in the light. The blind man stood barefooted on the floor, his hands clasping in one of the bitterest moments of his rebellion against, and defiance of, his helplessness of blindness. Below him, as he believed, his servants had been sacrificing life for him. There in that room he held in trust that which affected the security, the faith, the honor of others. His guarding that trust involved his honor no less. And particularly now, he knew he was bound, at whatever cost, to act. For he did not doubt now but that his half-prisoned guest, whom Santoin had not sufficiently guarded, was at the bottom of the attack. The blind man believed, therefore, that it was because of his own retention here of Eaton that the attack had been made. His servants had been killed. The private secrets of his associates were in danger. Santoin crossed to the door of the hall and opened it and called. No one answered immediately. He started to call again. Then he checked himself and shut the door, and opened that to the top of the stairs descending to his study below. The smoke and fumes of the firing rushed into his face. It half choked him, but it decided him. He was going to go down. Undoubtedly there was danger below, but that was why he did not call again at the other door for someone else to run a risk for him. Basil Santoin, always held back and always watched and obliged to submit to guard even of women in petty matters because of his blindness, held one thing dearer far than life, and that thing was the trust which other men reposed in him. Since it was that trust which was threatened, the impulse now, in that danger, to act for himself and not be protected and pushed back by anyone who merely could see, controlled him. He put his hand on the rail and started to descend the stairs. He was almost steady in step, and he had firm grasp of the rail. He noticed that now to wonder at it. When he had aroused at the sound of firing, his blindness, as always when something was happening about him, was obtruded upon him. He felt helpless because he was blind, not because he had been injured. He had forgotten entirely that for almost 2 weeks he had not stirred from bed. He had risen and stood and walked, without staggering, to the door and to the top of the stairs before. Now he remembered. So what he had already done showed him that he had merely again to put his injury from his mind, and he could go on. He went down the stairs almost steadily. There was still no sound or any evidence of anyone below. The gases of the firing were clearing away. The blind man could feel the slight breeze which came in through the windows of his bedroom and went with him down the stairs. And now, as he reached the lower steps, there was no other sound in the room but the tread of the blind man's bare feet on the stairs. This sound was slight, but enough to attract attention in the silence there. Santoine halted on the next to the last step. The blind count stairs, and he had gone down 21, and realized fully his futility. But now he would not retreat or merely call for help. "Who is here?" he asked distinctly. "Is anyone here? Who is here?" No one answered, and now Santoine knew by the sense which let him feel whether it was night or day, that the room was really dark for others as well as for himself. The lights were not burning, so an exaltation, a sense of physical capability, came to Santoine. In the dark he was as fit, as capable as any other man. Not more capable, for though he was familiar with the room, the furniture had been moved in the struggle. He had heard the overturning of the chairs. Santoine stepped down on the floor, and in his uncertainty as to the position of the furniture, felt along the wall. There were bookcases there, but he felt and passed along them swiftly until he came to the case which concealed the safe at the left side of the doors. The books were gone from that case. His bare toes struck against them where they had been thrown down on the floor. The blind man, his pulse beating tumultuously, put his hand through the case and felt the panel behind. That was slid back, exposing the safe, and the door of the safe stood open. Santoine's hands felt within the safe swiftly. The safe was empty. He recoiled from it, choking back an ejaculation. The entry to this room had been made for the purpose which he supposed, and the thieves must have succeeded in their errand. The blind man, in his uselessness for pursuit, could delay calling others to act for him no longer. He started toward the bell, when some scrape on the floor, not of the sort to be accounted for by an object moving by the wind, sounded behind him. Santoine swung toward the sound and stood listening again, and then, groping with his hand stretched out before him, he left the wall and stepped toward the center of the room. He took 2 steps, 3, 4, with no result. Then his foot trod on some fluid, thick and sticky, and not cold. Santoine stooped and put a finger-tip into the fluid and brought it near his nose. It was what he supposed it must be, blood. He raised his foot and with his great toe traced the course of the blood. It led to one side, and then the blind man's toe touched some hard metal object which was warm. He stooped and picked it up and felt over it with his fingers. It was an electric torch with the light turned on. Santoine stood holding it with the warm end, the lighted end, turned away from him. He swiftly switched it off. What put Santoine at a disadvantage with other men was light. But since there had been this light, there must be others. There had been at least 3 men, perhaps, therefore, 3 lights. Santoine's senses could not perceive light so dim and soft. He stood trying fruitlessly to determine whether there were other lights. He could hear now someone breathing, more than one person. From the house, still shut off by its double soundproof doors, he could hear nothing. But someone outside the house was hurrying up to the open window at the south end of the room. That one came too, or just inside the window, parting the curtains. He was breathing hard from exertion or from excitement. "Who is it?" Santoin challenged clearly. "Basil!" Blatchford's voice exclaimed his recognition in amazement. "Basil, that is you! What are you doing down here?" Blatchford started forward. "Wait!" Santoin ordered sharply. "Don't come any further. Stand there." Blatchford protested but obeyed. "What is it? What are you doing down here, Basil? What is the matter here? What has happened?" "What brought you here?" Santoin demanded instead of reply. "You were running outside. Why? What was out there? What did you see?" "See? I didn't see anything except the window here open when I came up. But I heard shots, Basil. I thought they were toward the road. I went out there, but I found nothing. I was coming back when I saw the window open. I'm sure I heard shots." "They were here," Santoin said. "But you can see, and you just heard the shots. You didn't see anything," the blind man accused. "You didn't see anyone going away from here?" "Basil, what has happened here?" Santoin felt again the stickiness at his feet. "3 or 4 persons fought in this room, Wallace. Some, or one, was hurt. There's blood on the floor. There are 2 here I can hear breathing. I suppose they're hurt. Probably the rest are gone. The room's all dark, isn't it? That is you moving about now, Wallace?" "Yes." "What are you doing?" "Looking for the light." "Don't." "Why, Basil?" "Get help first. I think those who aren't hurt are gone." "They must be gone." "But get help first, Wallace." "And leave you here?" Blatchford rejoined. He had not halted again. The blind man heard his cousin still moving along the wall. The electric switch clicked, and Santoin knew that the room was flooded with light. Santoin straightened, strained, turning his head a little to better listen. With the flashing on of the light, he had heard the sharp, involuntary start of Blatchford as he saw the room, and, besides that, Santoin heard movement now elsewhere in the room. Then the blind man heard his friend cry, "Good God!" It was not, Santoin instantly sensed, from mere surprise or fright at finding some intruder in the room. That must have been expected. This was from something more astounding, from something incredible. "What is it?" Santoin cried. "Good God, Basil!" "Who is it, Wallace?" The blind man knew now that his friend's incoherence came from recognition of someone, not alone from some sight of horror. "Who is it, Wallace?" he repeated, curbing himself. "Basil, it must be. I know him. It is—" A shot roared in front of Santoin. The blind man, starting back at the shock of it, drew in the powder gas with his breath, but the bullet was not for him. Instead, he heard his friend scream and choke and half call, half cough. "Wallace!" Santoin cried out, but his voice was lost in the roar of another shot. This was not fired by the same one who had just fired. At least, it was not from the same part of the room. And instantly, from another side, a third shot came. Then, in the midst of rush and confusion, another shot roared. The light was out again. Then all was gone. The noise was outside. The room was still, except for a cough and choke as Blatchford, somewhere on the floor in front of the blind man, tried again to speak. Basil Santoin, groping with his hands, found him. The blind man knelt and with his fingers went over his cousin's face. He found the wound on the neck where Blatchford's life was running away. He was still conscious. Santoin knew that he was trying his best to speak, to say just one word, a name, to tell him who he had seen and who had shot him. But he could not. Santoin put his hand over a hand of his cousin. "That's all right, Wally. That's all right," he assured him. And now he knew that Blatchford's consciousness was going forever. Santoin knew what must be most on his friend's mind at that last moment, as it had been most on his mind during more than 30 years. "And about my blindness, Wallace, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I'd never have done what I have if I hadn't been blind." Blatchford's fingers closed tightly on Santoin's. They did not relax, but now remained closed, though without strength. The blind man bowed and then lifted his head. His friend was dead, and others were rushing into the room. The butler, one of the chauffeurs, Avery, more men servants. The light was on again, and amid the tumult and alarms of the discoveries shown by the light, some rushed to the windows to the south in pursuit of those who had escaped from the room. Avery and one or two others rushed up to Santoin. Now the blind man heard, above their cries and alarms, the voice of his daughter. She was beside him, where he knelt next to the body of Blatchford, and she put back others who crowded about. "Father, what has happened? Why are you here? Oh, Father, Cousin Wallace!" "He is dead," Santoin said. "They shot him." "Father, how was it? There are none of them in the room?" he asked her in reply. "None of them?" Her failure to understand answered him. If any of the men who fought there had not got away, she would have understood. "They were not all together," he said. "They were 3, at least. One was not with the others. They fired at each other, I believe, after one shot him." Santoin's hand was still in Blatchford's. "I heard them below." He told shortly how he had gone down, how Blatchford had entered and been shot. The blind man, still kneeling, heard the ordering and organizing of others for the pursuit. Now women servants from the other part of the house were taking charge of affairs in the room. He heard Avery questioning them. None of the servants had had part in the fight in the room. There had been no signal heard, Santoin was told, upon any of the bells which he had tried to ring from his room. Eaton was the only person from the house who was missing. Harriet had gone for a moment. The blind man called her back and demanded that she stay beside him. He had not yet moved from Blatchford's body. His daughter returned. Her hand on his shoulder was trembling and cold. He could feel it cold through the linen of his pajama jacket. "Father, you must go back to bed," she commanded uselessly. He would not stir yet. A servant, at her call, brought a robe which she put over him, and she drew slippers on his feet. "They came, at least some of them came." Santoin had risen, fighting down his grief over his cousin's death. He stood holding the robe about him. "For what was in your safe, Harriet?" "I know. I saw it open." "What is gone?" Santoin demanded. He heard her picking up the contents of the safe from the floor and carrying them to the table and examining them. He was conscious that, having done this, she stood staring about the room as though to see whether anything had escaped her search. "What is gone?" Santoin repeated. "Why, nearly all the formal papers seem to be gone. Lists and agreements relating to a dozen different things." "None of the correspondence?" "No, that all seems to be here." Santoin was breathing quickly. The trust for which he had been ready to die, for which Blatchford had died, seemed safe, but recognition of this only emphasized and deepened his perplexity as to what the meaning had been of the struggle which an instant before had been going on around him. "We don't know whether he got it then or not." It was Avery's voice which broke in upon him. Santoin merely listened. "He? Who?" he heard his daughter's challenge. "Why, Eaton. It is plain enough what happened here, isn't it?" Avery answered. "He came here to this room for what he was after, for what he has been after from the first. whatever that may have been. He came prepared to force the safe and get it, but he was surprised." "By whom?" the blind man asked. "By whomever it is that has been following him. I don't attempt to explain who they were, Mr. Santoin, for I don't know. But whoever they were, in doing this, he laid himself open to attack by them. They were watching, saw him enter here. They attacked him here. Wallace switched on the light and recognized him. So he shot Wallace and ran with whatever he could grab up of the contents of the safe, hoping that by luck he'd get what he was after." "It isn't so! It isn't so!" Harriet denied. Her father checked her. He stood an instant thoughtful. "Who was directing the pursuit, Donald?" he asked. Avery went out at once. The window to the south, which stood open, was closed. The blind man turned to his daughter. "Now, Harriet," he commanded. He put a hand out and touched Harriet's clothing. He found she had on a heavy robe. She understood that her father would not move till she had seen the room for him. She gazed about again, therefore, and told him what she saw. "There was some sort of a struggle near my safe," she said. "Chairs, everything there is knocked about." "Yes." "There is also blood there, a big spot of it on the floor." "I found that," said Santoin. "There is blood behind this table near the middle of the room." "Ah, a man fired from near there, too." "There are cartridges on the floor." "Cartridges?" "Cartridge shells, I mean, empty, near both those spots of blood. There are cartridge shells near the fireplace, but no blood there." "Yes. The bullets?" "There are marks everywhere, above the mantel, all about." "Yes." "There's a bar of iron with a bent end near the table, between it and the window. There are 2 flashlights, both extinguished." "How was the safe opened?" "The combination has been cut completely away. There is an instrument connected with the electric light fixture which seems to have done the cutting. There's a hand drill, too. I think it is a hand drill. The inner door has been drilled through and the catches drawn back." "Who is this?" The valet who had been sent to Eaton's room had returned with his report. "Mr. Eaton went from his room fully dressed, sir," he said to Santoin, "except for his shoes. I found all his shoes in his room." During the report the blind man felt his daughter's grasp on his arm become tense and relax and tighten again. Then, as though she realized she was adding to his comprehension of what she had already betrayed, she suddenly took her hand from her father's arm. Santoin turned his face toward his daughter. Another twinge racked the tumult of his emotions. He groped and groped again, trying to catch his daughter's hand, but she avoided him. She directed servants to lift Blatchford's body and told them where to bear it. After that Santoin resisted no longer. He let the servants, at his daughter's direction, help him to his room. His daughter went with him and saw that he was safe in bed. She stood beside him while the nurse washed the blood splotches from his hands and feet. When the nurse had finished, he still felt his daughter's presence. She drew nearer to him. "Father?" she questioned. "Yes?" "You don't agree with Donald, do you? That Mr. Eaton went to the study to get something, and that whoever has been following him found him there and interrupted him, and he killed Cousin Wallace?" Santoin was silent an instant. "That seems the correct explanation, Harriet," he evaded. "It does not fully explain, but it seems correct as far as it goes. If Donald asks you what my opinion is, tell him that is it." He felt his daughter shrink away from him. The blind man made no move to draw her back to him. He lay perfectly still. His head rested flat upon the pillows. His hands were clasped tightly together above the coverlet. He had accused himself, in the room below, because by the manner he had chosen to treat Eaton, he had slain the man he loved best, and had forced a friendship with Eaton on his daughter, which, he saw, had gone further than mere friendship. It had gone, he knew now, even to the irretrievable between man and woman, had brought her, that is, the state where, no matter what Eaton was or did, she must suffer with him. But Santoine was not accusing himself now. He was feeling only the fulfillment of that threat against those who had trusted him with their secrets, which he had felt vaguely after the murder of Gabriel Warden, and more plainly with the events of each succeeding day ever since. For that threat, just now, had culminated in his presence in purposeful, violent action, but Santoine, in his blindness, had been unable, and was still unable, to tell what that action meant. Of the three men who had fought in his presence in the room below, one before the safe, one at the fireplace, and one behind the table, which had been Eaton? What had he been doing there? Who were the others? What had any of them, or all of them, wanted? For Santoine, the answer to these questions transcended now every personal interest. So, in his uncertainty, Santoine had drawn into himself, withdrawn confidence in his thoughts from all around, from Donald Avery, even from his daughter, until the answer should be found. His blind eyes were turned toward the ceiling, and his long, well-shaped fingers trembled with the intensity of his thought. But he realized, even in his absorption, that his daughter had drawn away from him. So, presently, he stirred. "Harriet," he said. It was the nurse who answered him. "Miss Santoine has gone downstairs. What is it you want of her, Mr. Santoine?" The blind man hesitated, and checked the impulse he had had. "Nothing," he replied. End of chapter 18. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 19 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pursuit. Harriet Santoine, still clad only in the heavy robe over her nightdress and in slippers, went from her father's bedroom swiftly down into the study again. What she was going to do there she did not definitely know. She heard, as she descended the stairs, the steward in the hall outside the study calling up the police stations of the neighboring villages and giving news of what had happened, and instructions to watch the roads. But as she reached the foot of the stairs, a servant closed the study doors. The great curtained room, in its terrifying disorder, was brightly lighted, empty, absolutely still. She had given directions that, except for the removal of Blatchford's body, all must be left as it was in the room till the arrival of the police. She stood an instant with hands pressed against her breast, staring down at the spots upon the floor. There were 3 of these spots now, one where Blatchford's body had lain. They were soaking brownly into the rugs, but standing still red and thick upon the polished floor. Was one of them Eaton's? Something within her told her that it was, and the fierce desire to go to him, to help him, was all she felt just now. It was Donald Avery's and her father's accusation of Eaton that had made her feel like this. She had been feeling, the moment before Donald had spoken, that Philip Eaton had played upon her that evening in making her take him to his confederate in the ravine in order to plan and consummate something here. Above her grief and horror at the killing of her cousin and the danger to her father, had risen the anguish of her guilt with Eaton, the agony of her betrayal. But their accusation that Eaton had killed Wallace Blatchford, seeing him, knowing him, in the light, had swept all that away. All there was of her seemed to have risen in denial of that. Before her eyes, half shut, she saw again the body of her cousin Wallace lying in its blood on the floor, with her father kneeling beside it, his blind eyes raised in helplessness to the light. But she saw now another body, too. Eaton's, not here, lying somewhere in the bare, windswept woods, shot down by those pursuing him. She looked at the face of the clock, and then down to the pendulum to see whether it had stopped. But the pendulum was swinging. The hands stood at 1:30. Now she recalled that, in her first wild gaze about the room, when she rushed in with the others, she had seen the hands showing a minute or so short of 20 minutes past 1. Not quite a quarter of an hour had passed since the alarm. The pursuit could not have moved far away. She reopened the window through which the pursuers had passed and stepped out onto the dark lawn. She stood drawing the robe about her against the chill night air, dazed, stunned. The house behind her, the stables, the chauffeur's quarters above the garages, the gardener's cottages, all blazed now with light, but she saw no one about. The men servants, except the steward, had joined their pursuit. She heard them to the south beating the naked woods and shrubbery and calling to each other. A half-mile down the beach she heard shouts and a shot. She saw dimly through the night in that direction a boat without lights moving swiftly out upon the lake. Her hands clenched and pressed against her breast. She stood straining at the sounds of the manhunt. It had turned west, it seemed. It was coming back her way, but to the west of the house. She staggered a little and could not stand. She stepped away from the house in the direction of the pursuit, following the way it seemed to be going. She crossed the lawn toward the garage. A light suddenly shone out there, and she went on. The wide door at the car driveway was pushed open, and someone was within working over a car. His back was toward her, and he was bent over the engine, but at the glance she knew him and recoiled, gasping. It was Eaton. He turned at the same instant and saw her. "Oh, it's you!" he cried to her. Her heart, which almost had ceased to beat, raced her pulses again. At the sound she had made on the driveway, he had turned to her as a hunted thing, cornered, desperate, certain that whoever came must be against him. His cry to her had recognized her as the only one who could come and not be against him. It had hailed her with relief as bringing him help. He could not have cried out so, at that instant at sight of her, if he had been guilty of what they had accused. Now she saw, too, as he faced her, blood flowing over his face. Blood soaked a shoulder of his coat, and his left arm dangling at his side. But now, as he threw back his head and straightened in his relief at finding it was she who had surprised him, she saw in him an exultation and excitement she had never seen before, something which her presence alone could not have caused. Tonight, she sensed vaguely, something had happened to him which had changed his attitude toward her and everything else. "Yes, it's I," she cried quickly and rushed to him. "It's I! It's I!" Wildly she reassured him. "You're hurt." She touched his shoulder. "You're hurt. I knew you were." He pushed her back with his right hand and held her away from him. "Did they hurt your father?" "Hurt father? No." "But Mr. Blatchford—" "Dead," she answered dully. "They killed him, then?" "Yes, they—" she iterated. He was telling her now, unnecessarily, that he had had nothing to do with it. It was the others who had done that. He released her and wiped the blood from his eyes with the heel of his hand. "The poor old man," he said. "The poor old man." She drew toward him in the realization that he could find sympathy for others even in such a time as this. "Where's the key?" he demanded of her. He stared over her again, but without surprise even in his eyes, at her state. If she was there at all at that time, that was the only way she could have come. "The key?" "The key for the battery and magneto. The key you start the car with." She ran to a shelf and brought it to him. He used it and pressed the starting lever. The engine started, and he sprang to the seat, his left arm still dangling useless at his side. He tried to throw in the gears with his right hand, but the mechanism of the car was strange to him. She leaped up beside him. "Move over," she commanded. "It's this way." He slipped to the side, and she took the driving seat, threw in the gears expertly, and the car shot from the garage. She switched on the electric headlights as they dashed down the driveway and threw a bright white glare upon the roadway 100 yards ahead to the gates. Beyond the gates, the public pike ran north and south. "Which way?" she demanded of him, slowing the car. "Stop!" he cried to her. "Stop and get out. You mustn't do this." "You could not pass alone," she said. "Father's men would close the gates upon you." "The men? There are no men there now. They went to the beach before. They must have heard something there. It was their being there that turned the others back. They tried for the lake and were turned back and got away in a machine. I followed, back up here." Harriet Santon glanced at the face of the man beside her. She could see his features only vaguely. She could see no expression, only the position of his head. But now she knew that she was not helping him to run away. He was no longer hunted. At least, he was not only hunted. He was hunting others, too. As the car rolled down upon the open gates, and she strained forward in the seat beside her, she knew that what he was feeling was a wild eagerness in the pursuit. "Right or left, quick!" she demanded of him. "I'll take one or the other." "Right," he shot out, but already remembering the direction of the pursuit, she had chosen the road to the right and raced on. He caught the driving wheel with his good hand and tried to take it from her. She resisted and warned him. "I'm going to drive this car. If you try to take it, it'll throw us both into a ditch." "If we catch up with them, they'll shoot. Give me the car," he begged. "We'll catch up with them first." "Then you'll do what I say?" "Yes." She made the bargain. "There are their tracks." He pointed for her. The road was soft with the rains that preceded spring, and she saw in the bright flare of the headlights where some heavy car, fast driven, had gouged deep into the earth at the roadside. She noted the pattern of the tires. "How do you know those are their tracks?" she asked him. "I told you. I followed them to where they got their machine." "Who are they?" "The men who shot Mr. Blatchford." "Who are they?" she put to him directly again. He waited, and she knew that he was not going to answer her directly. She was running the car now at very high speed. The tiny electric light above the speedometer showed they were running at 45 miles an hour, and the strip was still turning to higher figures. Suddenly he caught her arm. The road had forked, and he pointed to the left. She swung the car that way, again seeing, as they made the turn, the tire tracks they were following. She was not able now to watch these tracks. She could watch only the road and the car. But she was aware that the way they were following had led them into and out of private grounds. Plainly, the men they were following knew the neighborhood well and had chosen this road in advance as avoiding the more public roads which might be watched. She noted that they were turning away to the left. Now she understood that they were making a great circle to west and north and returning toward, but well west of, her father's house. Thus she knew that those they were following had made this circuit to confuse pursuit, and that their objective was the great city to the south. They were racing now over a little used road which bisected a forested section still held as acreage, old rickety wooden bridges spanning the ravines. One of these appeared in the radiance of the headlight 100 yards ahead. The next instant the car was dashing upon it. Harriet could feel the shake and tremble of the loosely nailed boards as the driving wheels struck. There was a crash as some strut below gave way. The old bridge bent but recoiled. The car bounded across it, the rear wheels skidding in the moist earth as they swung off the boards. Harriet felt Eaton grab her arm. "You mustn't do that again." "Why?" "You mustn't do that again." He repeated the order. It was too obvious to tell her it was not safe. She laughed. Less than 5 minutes before, as she stood outside the room where her father's cousin had just been murdered, it had seemed she could never laugh again. The car raced up a little hill and now again was descending. The headlights showed another bridge over a ravine. "Slow! Stop!" her companion commanded. She paid no attention and raced the car on. He put his hand on the wheel and with his foot tried to push hers from the accelerator, but she fought him. The car swayed and all but ran away as they approached the bridge. "Give it to me!" she screamed at him and wrenched the car about. It was upon the bridge and across it, as they skidded upon the mud of the road again. They could hear the bridge cracking behind. "Harriet!" he pleaded with her. She steered the car on, recklessly, her heart thumping with more than the thrill of the chase. "They're the men who tried to kill you, aren't they?" she rejoined. The speed at which they were going did not permit her to look about. She had to keep her eyes on the road at that moment, when she knew within herself, and was telling the man beside her, that she, from that moment, must be at one with him. For already she had said it. As she risked herself in the pursuit, she thought of the men they were after not chiefly as those who had killed her cousin, but as those who had threatened Eaton. "What do I care what happens to me if we catch them?" she cried. "Harriet!" He repeated her name again. "Philip!" She felt him shrink in chains as she called the name. It had been clear to her, of course, that, since she had known him, the name he had been using was not his own. Often she had wondered what his name was. Now she had to know. "What should I call you?" she demanded of him. "My name," he said, "is Hugh." "Hugh," she called it. "Yes." "Hugh." She waited for the rest, but he told her no more. "Hugh," she whispered to herself again, his name now. "Hugh." Her eyes, which had watched the road for the guiding of the car, had followed his gesture from time to time, pointing out the tracks made by the machine they were pursuing. These tracks still ran on ahead. As she gazed down the road, a red glow beyond the bare trees was lighting the sky. A glance at Hugh told her that he also had seen it. "A fire?" she referred to him. "Looks like it." They said no more as they rushed on, but the red glow was spreading, and yellow flames soon were in sight, shooting higher and higher. These were clouded off for an instant only, to appear flaring higher again, and the breeze brought the smell of seasoned wood burning. "It's right across the road," Hugh announced as they neared it. "It's the bridge over the next ravine," Harriet said. Her foot already was bearing upon the brake, and the power was shut off. The car coasted on slowly, for both could see now that the wooden span was blazing from end to end. It was old wood, swift to burn and going like tinder. There was no possible chance for the car to cross it. The girl brought the machine to a stop 50 feet from the edge of the ravine. The fire was so hot that the gasoline tank would not be safe near her. She gazed down at the tire marks on the road. "They crossed with their machine," she said to Hugh, "and fired the bridge behind. They must have poured gasoline over it and lighted it at both ends." She sat with her hand still straining at the driving wheel, the other playing with the gear lever. "There's no other way across that ravine, I suppose?" Hugh questioned her. The other road's back more than a mile and 2 miles about." She threw in the reverse and started to turn. Hugh shook his head. "That's no use." "No," she agreed, and stopped the car again. Hugh stepped down on the ground. A man appeared on the other side of the ravine. He stood and stared at the burning span, and, seeing the machine on the other side, he scrambled down the slope of the ravine. Eaton met him as he came up to the road again. The man was one of the artisans, a carpenter or jack-of-all-work, who had little cottages, with patches for gardens, through the undivided acreage beyond the big estates. He had hastily and only partly dressed. He stared at Eaton's hurt with astonishment, which increased as he gazed at the girl in the driving seat of the car. He did not recognize her except as one of the class to whom he owed employment. He pulled off his cap and stared back to Eaton with wonder. "What happened, sir? What's the matter?" Eaton did not answer, but Harriet now recognized the man. "Mr. Blatchford was shot tonight at Father's house, Dibley," she said. "Miss Antoine!" Dibley cried. "We think the men went this way," she continued. "Did you see anyone pass?" Eaton challenged the man. "In a motor, sir?" "Yes, down this road in a motor." "Yes, sir." "When?" "Just now, sir." "Just now?" "Not 5 minutes ago. Just before I saw the bridge on fire here." "How was that?" "I live there just beyond, near the road. I heard my pump going." "Your pump?" "Yes, sir. I've a pump in my front yard. There's no water pipe through here, sir." "Of course. Go on, Dibley." "I looked out and saw a machine stopped out in the road. One man was putting water into a bucket for another." "Then what did you do?" "Nothing, sir. I just watched them. Motor people often stop at my pump for water." "I see. Go on." "That's all about them, sir. I thought nothing about it. They wouldn't wake me to ask for water. They'd just take it. Then I saw the fire over there." "No, go back," Eaton interrupted. "First, how many men were there in the car?" "How many? 3, sir." Eaton started. "Only 3? You're sure?" "Yes, sir. I could see them plain. There was the 2 at the pump. One more stayed in the car." Eaton seized the man in his intentness. "You're sure there weren't any more, Dibley? Think, be sure. There weren't 3 more or even 1 more person hidden in the tonneau of the car?" "The tonneau, sir?" The back seats, I mean." "No, sir. I could see into their car. It was almost right below me, sir. My house has a room above. That's where I was sleeping." "Then did you watch the men with the water?" "Watch them, sir?" "What they did with it. You're sure they didn't take it to the rear seat to give to someone there? You see, we think one of the men was hurt," Eaton explained. "No, sir. I'd notice if they did that." "Then did they put it into the radiator, here in front where motorists use water?" Dibley stared. "No, sir. I didn't think of it then, but they didn't. They didn't put it into the car. They took it in their bucket with them. It was one of those folding buckets motor people have." Eaton gazed at the man. "Only 3, you are sure?" he repeated. "And none of them seemed to be hurt?" "No, sir." "Then they went off in the other direction from the bridge?" "Yes, sir. I didn't notice the bridge burning till after they went, so I came down here." Eaton let the man go. Dibley looked again at the girl and moved away a little. She turned to Eaton. "What does that mean?" she called to him. "How many should there have been in the machine? What did they want with the water?" "6," Eaton told her. "There should have been 6 in the machine, and one, at least, badly hurt." Dibley stood dully apart, staring at one and then at the other, and next to the flaming bridge. He looked down the road. "There's another car coming," he announced. "2 cars." The double glare from the headlights of a motor shone through the tree trunks as the car topped and came swiftly down a rise 3/4 of a mile away, and around the last turn back on the road. Another pair of blinding lights followed. There was no doubt that this must be the pursuit from Santoine's house. Eaton stood beside Harriet, who had stayed in the driving seat of the car. "You know Dibley well, Harriet?" he asked. "He's worked on our place. He's dependable," she answered. Eaton put his hand over hers, which still clung to the driving wheel. "I'm going just beside the road here," he said to her quietly. "I'm armed, of course. If those are your people, you'd better go back with them. I'm sure they are, but I'll wait and see." She caught at his hand. "No, no," she cried. "You must get as far away as you can before they come. I'm going back to meet and hold them." She threw the car into reverse, backed and turned it, and brought it again into the road. He came beside her again, putting out his hand. She seized it. Her hands for an instant clung to it, his to hers. "You must go quick," she urged. "But how am I to know what becomes of you, where you are? Shall I hear from you? Shall I ever see you?" "No news will be good news," he said, "until—" "Until what?" "Until—" And again that unknown something which 1,000 times, it seemed to her, had checked his word and action toward her, made him pause. But nothing could completely bar them from one another now. "Until they catch and destroy me. Or until I come to you as you have never known me yet." An instant more she clung to him. The double headlights flared into sight again upon the road, much nearer now and coming fast. She released him. He plunged into the bushes beside the road, and the damp, bare twigs lashed against one another at his passage. Then she shot her car forward, but she had made only a few hundred yards when the first of the 2 cars met her. It turned to the right to pass. She turned the same way. The approaching car twisted to the left. She swung hers to oppose it. The 2 cars did not strike. They stopped, radiator to radiator, with rear wheels locked. The second car drew up behind the first. The glare of her headlights showed her both were full of armed men. Their headlights, revealing her to them, hushed suddenly their angry ejaculations. She recognized Avery in the first car. He leaped out and ran to her. "Harriet, in God's name, what are you doing here?" She sat unmoved in her seat, gazing at him. Men leaped from the cars, ran past her down the road toward the ravine and the burning bridge. She longed to look once more in the direction in which Eaton had disappeared, but she did not. Avery reached up and over the side of the car and caught her arm, repeating his demand for an explanation. She could see, turning in her seat, the men who had run past surrounding Dibley on the road and questioning him. Avery, gaining no satisfaction from her, let go her arm, his hand dropped to the back of the seat, and he drew it up quickly. "Harriet, there's blood here." She did not reply. He stared at her and seemed to comprehend. He shouted to the men around Dibley and ran toward them. They called in answer to his shout, and she could see Dibley pointing out to them the way Eaton had gone. The men scattering themselves at intervals along the edge of the wood, and under Avery's direction, posting others in each direction to watch the road, began to beat through the bushes after Eaton. She sat watching. She put her cold hands to her face. Then, recalling how just now Eaton's hand had clung to hers, She pressed them to her lips. Avery came running back to her. "You drove him out here, Harriet," he charged. "Dibley says so." "Him? Who?" she asked coolly. "Eaton. Dibley did not know him, but described him. It can have been no one else. He was hurt." The triumph in the ejaculation made her recoil. "He was hurt and could not drive, and you drove him out." His tone changed suddenly. "Like this." For the first time since she had left the garage, she was suddenly conscious that she was in her nightdress with only a robe and slippers. She drew the robe quickly about her, shrinking and staring at him. In all the miles she had driven that night with Eaton at her side, she never a moment had shrunk from her companion or thought how she was dressed. It was not the exultation and excitement of what she was doing that had prevented her. It went deeper than that. It was the attitude of her companion toward her. But Avery had thought of it, and made her think of it at once, even in the excitement under which he was laboring. He left her again, running after the men into the woods. She sat in the car, listening to the sounds of the hunt. She could see, back of her, in the light of the burning bridge, one of the armed men standing to watch the road ahead of her, but almost indistinguishable in the darkness was another. The noise of the hunt had moved further into the woods. She had no immediate fear that they would find Eaton. Her present anxiety was over his condition from his hurts and what might happen if he encountered those he had been pursuing. In that neighborhood, with its woods and bushes and ravines to furnish cover, the darkness made discovery of him by Avery and his men impossible if Eaton wished to hide himself. Avery appeared to realize this, for now the voices in the woods ceased and the men began to straggle back toward the cars. A party was sent on foot across the ravine, evidently to guard the road beyond. The rest began to clamber into the cars. She backed her car away from the one in front of it and started home. She had gone only a short distance when the cars again passed her, traveling at high speed. She began then to pass individual men left by those in the cars to watch the road. At the first large house, she saw one of the cars again, standing empty. She passed it without stopping. A mile further, a little group of men carrying guns stopped her, recognized her, and let her pass. They had been called out, they told her, by Mr. Avery over the telephone to watch the roads for Eaton. They had Eaton's description. Members of the local police were to take charge of them and direct them. She comprehended that Avery was surrounding the vacant acreage where Eaton had taken refuge to be certain that Eaton did not get away until daylight came and a search for him was possible. Lights gleamed at her across the broad lawns of the houses near her father's great house as she approached it. At the sound of her car, people came to the windows and looked out. She understood that news of the murder at Basil Santoin's had aroused the neighbors and brought them from their beds. As she left her motor on the drive beside the house, for tonight no one came from the garage to take it, the little clock upon the dash marked 2:30. End of chapter 19. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 20 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Waiting. Harriet went into the house and toward her own rooms. A maid met and stopped her on the stairs. "Mr. Santoin sent word that he wishes to see you as soon as you came in, Miss Santoin." Harriet went on toward her father's room without stopping at her own, wet with the drive through the damp night and shivering now with its chill. Her father's voice answered her knock with a summons to come in. As she obeyed, pushing the doors open, he dismissed the nurse. The girl, passing Harriet as she went out, returned Harriet's questioning look with a reassuring nod. Basil Santoin had endured the shock and excitement of the night better than could have been expected. He was quite himself. As Harriet went toward the bed, her father's blind eyes turned toward her. He put out his hand and touched her, seeming startled to find her still in the robe she had worn an hour before, and to feel that the robe was wet. "Where have you been, daughter?" he asked. She hesitated, drawing the robe out of his hand. I have been driving Mr. Eaton in a motor," she said. "Helping him to escape?" A spasm crossed the blind man's face. "He said not. He was following the men who shot Cousin Wallace." The blind man lay for an instant still. "Tell me," he commanded finally. She told him, beginning with her discovery of Eaton in the garage and ending with his leaving her and with Donald Avery's finding her in the motor. And now she held back one word only, his name, which he had told her, Hugh. Her father listened intently. When she had finished, he made no move, no comment, no reproach. She had seated herself on the chair beside his bed. She looked away, then back to him. "That is not all," she said, and she told him of her expedition with Eaton to the ravine before the attack in the house. Again she waited. "You and Mr. Eaton appear to have become rather well acquainted, Harriet," he said. "Has he told you nothing about himself which you have not told me? You have seen nothing concerning him which you have not told?" Her mind went quickly back to the polo game. She felt a flush, which his blind eyes could not see, dyeing her cheeks and forehead. "No," she answered. She was aware that he did not accept the denial, that he knew she was concealing something. "Nothing?" he asked again. She put her hands to her face, then she drew them quickly away. "Nothing," she said steadily. The blind man waited for a moment. He put out his hand and pressed the bell, which called the steward. Neither spoke until the steward had come. "Fairly," Santoyne said then, quietly. "Miss Santoyne and I have just agreed that for the present all reports regarding the pursuit of the men who entered the study last night are to be made direct to me, not through Miss Santoyne or Mr. Avery." "Very well, sir." She still sat silent after the steward had gone. She thought for an instant her father had forgotten her presence. Then he moved slightly. "That is all, dear," he said quietly. She got up and left him, and went to her own rooms. She did not pretend to herself that she could rest. She bathed and dressed and went downstairs. The library had windows facing to the west. She went in there and stood looking out. Somewhere to the west was Eaton, alone, wounded. She knew she need not think of him yet as actively hunted, only watched. With daylight the hunt would begin. Would he be able to avoid the watchers and escape before the actual hunt for him began? She went out into the hall to the telephone. She could not get the use of the phone at once. The steward was posted there. The calls upon the phone were continual, from neighbors who, awakened to learn the news of Blatchford's death and the hunt for his murderer, called to offer what help they could, and from the newspapers, which somehow had been notified. The telephones in the bedrooms all were on this wire. There was a private telephone in the library. Somehow she could not bring herself to enter that room, closed and to be left with everything in its disorder until the arrival of the police. The only other telephone was in her father's bedroom. She took advantage of a momentary interruption in the calls to call up the local police station. The man at the other end became deferential at once. He told her what was being done, confirming what she already knew. The roads were being watched, and men had been posted at all nearby railway stations and at the stopping points of the interurban line to prevent Eaton from escaping that way. The man spoke only of Eaton. He showed the conviction, gathered, she felt sure, by telephone conversation with Donald Avery, that Eaton was the murderer. "He ain't likely to get away, Miss Santoyne," he assured her. "He's got no shoes, I understand, and he has one or maybe two shots through him." She shrunk back and nearly dropped the phone at the vision which his words called up. Yet there was nothing new to her in that vision. It was continually before her eyes. It was the only thing of which she could think. "You'll call me as soon as you know anything more," she requested. "Will you call me every hour?" She hung up on receiving assurance of this. A servant brought a written paper. She took it before she recognized that it was not for her, but for the steward. It was a short statement of the obvious physical circumstances of the murder, evidently dictated by her father and intended for the newspapers. She gave it to Fairleigh, who began reading it over the telephone to the newspapers. She wandered again to the west windows. She was not consciously listening to the telephone conversation in the hall, yet enough reached her to make her know that reporters were rushing from the city by train and automobile. The last city editions of the morning papers would have at least the fact of the murder. There would be later extras. The afternoon papers would have it all. There was a long list of relatives and friends to whom it was due that telegraphic announcement of Wallace Blatchford's death reached them before they read it as a sensation publicly printed. Recollection of these people at least gave her something to do. She went up to her own room, listed the names, and prepared the telegrams for them. She came down again and gave the telegrams to Fairleigh to transmit by telephone. As she descended the stairs, the great clock in the lower hall struck once. It was 3:15. There was a stir in these lower rooms now. The officers of the local police had arrived. She went with them to the study, where they assumed charge nervously and uncertainly. She could not bear to be in that room. Nevertheless, she remained and answered their questions. She took them to Eaton's rooms on the floor above, where they searched through and took charge of all his things. She left them and came down again and went out to the front of the house. The night was sharp with the chill preceding the day. It had cleared. The stars were shining. As she stood looking to the west, the lights of a motor turned into the grounds. She ran toward it, thinking it must be bringing word of some sort, but the men who leaped from it were strangers to her. They were the first of the reporters to arrive. They tried to question her, but she ran from them into the house. She watched from the windows and saw other reporters arriving. To Harriet, there seemed to be scores of them. Every morning paper in Chicago, immediately upon receipt of the first flash, had sent at least 3 men. Every evening paper seemed to have aroused half its staff from their beds and sent them racing to the blind millionaire's home on the North Shore. Even men from Milwaukee papers arrived at 4:00. Forbidden the house, they surrounded it and captured servants. They took flashlights till, driven from the lawn, they went away, many of them, to see and take part in the search through the woods for Blatchford's murderer. The murder of Santoyne's cousin, the man, moreover, who had blinded Santoyne, in the presence of the blind man, was enough of itself to furnish a newspaper sensation. But following so closely Santoyne's visit to the coast because of the murder of Gabriel Warden, the newspaper men sensed instantly in it the possibility of some greater sensation not yet bared. Harriet was again summoned. A man, a stranger, was awaiting her in the hall. He was the precursor of those who would sit that day upon Wallace Blatchford's death and try to determine, formally, whose was the hand that had done it. The coroner's man. He, too, she saw, was already convinced what hand it had been, Eaton's. She took him to the study, then to the room above where Wallace Blatchford lay dead. She stood by while he made his brief, conventional examination. She looked down at the dead man's face. Poor Cousin Wallace, he had destroyed his own life long before, when he had destroyed her father's sight. From that time on, he had lived only to recompense her father for his blindness. Cousin Wallace's life had been a pitiable, hopeless, loving perpetuation of his penance. He had let himself hold nothing of his own in life. He had died, as she knew he would have wished to die, giving his life in service to his cousin. She was not unduly grieving over him. She answered the man's questions calmly and collectedly, but her mind was not upon what she was saying. Her mind was upon only one thing. Even of that she could not think connectedly. Some years ago, something, she did not know what, had happened to Hugh. Tonight, in some strange way unknown to her, it had culminated in her father's study. He had fought someone. He had rushed away to follow someone. Whom? Had he heard that someone in the study and gone down? Had he been fighting their battle, her father's and hers? She knew that was not so. Hugh had been fully dressed. What did it mean that he had said to her that these events would either destroy him or would send him back to her as something different? Her thought supplied no answer. But whatever he had done, whatever he might be, she knew his fate was hers now, for she had given herself to him utterly. She had told that to herself as she fled and pursued with him that night. She had told it to him, she later had told it, though she had not meant to yet, to her father. She could only pray now that out of the events of this night might not come a grief to her too great for her to bear. She went to the rooms that had been Eaton's. The police, in stripping them of his possessions, had overlooked his cap. She found the bit of gray cloth and hugged it to her. She whispered his name to herself, Hugh, that secret of his name which she had kept. She gloried that she had that secret with him, which she could keep from them all. What wouldn't they give just to share that with her, his name, Hugh? She started suddenly, looking through the window. The east above the lake was beginning to grow gray. The dawn was coming. It was beginning to be day. She hurried to the other side of the house, looking toward the west. How could she have left him, hurt and bleeding and alone in the night? She could not have done that, but that his asking her to go had told that it was for his safety as well as hers. She could not help him any more then. She would only have been in the way. But now she started to rush out, but controlled herself. She had to stay in the house. That was where the first word would come, if they caught him. And then he would need her. How much more? The reporters on the lawn below her, seeing her at the window, called up to her to know further particulars of what had happened and what the murder meant. She could see them plainly in the increasing light. She could see the lawn and the road before the house. Day had come. And with the coming of day, the uncertainty and disorder within and about the house seemed to increase. But in the south wing, with its soundproof doors and its windows closed against the noises from the lawn, there was silence. And in this silence, an exact, compelling, methodic machine was working. The mind of Basil Santoin was striving, vainly as yet, but with growing chances of success, to fit together into the order in which they belonged and make clear the events of the night and all that had gone before, arranging, ordering, testing, discarding, picking up again and reordering all that had happened since that other murder of Gabriel Warden. End of chapter 20. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 21 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What One Can Do Without Eyes. The blind man, lying on his bed in the darkness in which he had lived since his 16th year, and which no daylight could lessen, felt the light and knew that day had come. He stirred impatiently. The nurse, the only other occupant of the room, moved expectantly. Then she sank back. Santoin had moved, but had not roused from the absorption in which he had been ever since returning to his bed. He had not slept. The connections of the electric bells had been repaired. The wires had been found pulled from their batteries, but Santoin had not moved a hand to touch a button. He had disregarded the warning of the doctor, who had been summoned at once after the murder and had come to his room again just before dawn to warn him that after his recklessness of the night he must expect a reaction. He had given such injunctions in regard to any new development that he was certain that, even if his servants believed him asleep, they would report to him. But there had been no report, and Santoin expected none immediately. He had not lain awake, awaiting anything. He felt that so much had happened, so many facts were at his command, that somewhere among them must be the key to what they meant. The blind man knew that his daughter was concealing something from him. He could not tell what the importance of the thing she was concealing might be, but he knew his daughter was enough like himself for it to be useless for him to try to force from her something she did not mean to tell. The new intimacy of the relation between his daughter and Eaton was perfectly plain to Santoin, but it did not cause him to try to explain anything in Eaton's favor, nor did it prejudice him against him. He had appeared to accept Avery's theory of what had happened in the study because by doing so he concealed what was going on in his own mind. He actually accepted it only to the point of agreeing that Eaton must have met in the study those enemies, or someone representing the enemies, who had attacked him with the motor car and had before attempted to attack him on the train. 3 men, at least 3 men, had fought in the study in Santoin's presence. Eaton, it was certain, had been the only one from the house present when the first shots were fired. Had Eaton been alone against the other 2? Had Eaton been with one of the other 2 against the third? It appeared probable to Santoin that Eaton had been alone, or had come alone, to the study and had met his enemies there. Had these enemies surprised Eaton in the study, or had he surprised them? Santoin was inclined to believe that Eaton had surprised them. The contents taken from the safe had certainly been carried away, and these would have made rather a bulky bundle. Eaton could not have carried it without Harriet knowing it. Santoin believed that, whatever knowledge his daughter might be concealing from him, she would not have concealed this. It was certain that some time had been necessary for opening the safe before those opening it suffered interruption. Santoin felt, therefore, that the probabilities were that Eaton's enemies had opened the safe and had been surprised by Eaton. But if they had opened the safe, they were not only Eaton's enemies, they were also Santoin's. They were the men who threatened Santoin's trust. Those whom Eaton had fought in the room had had perfect opportunity for killing Santoin, if they wished. He had stood first in the dark with the electric torch in his hand. Then he had been before them in the light after Blatchford had entered. But Santoin felt certain no one had made any attack upon him at any moment in the room. He had had no feeling, at any instant, that any of the shots fired had been directed at him. Blatchford, too, had been unattacked until he had made it plain that he had recognized one of the intruders. Then, before Blatchford could call the name, he had been shot down. It was clear, then, that what had protected Santoin was his blindness. He had no doubt that, if he had been able to see and recognize the men in the room after the lights were turned on, he would have been shot down also. But Santoin recognized that this did not fully account for his immunity. 2 weeks before, an attack which had been meant for Eaton had struck down Santoin instead, and no further attempt against Eaton had been made until it had become publicly known that Santoin was not going to die. If Santoin's death would have served for Eaton's death 2 weeks before, why was Santoin immune now? Did possession of the contents of Santoin's safe accomplish the same thing as Santoin's death? Or more than his death for these men? For what men? It was not, Santoin was certain, Eaton's presence in the study which had so astounded Blatchford. Wallace and Eaton had passed days together, and Blatchford was accustomed to Eaton's presence in the house. Someone whom Blatchford knew, and whose name Santoin also would know, and whose presence in the room was so strange and astonishing that Blatchford had tried to prepare Santoin for the announcement, had been there. The man whose name was on Blatchford's tongue, or the companion of that man, had shot Blatchford rather than let Santoin hear the name. The blind man stirred upon his bed. "Do you want something, Mr. Santoin?" the nurse asked. The blind man did not answer. He was beginning to find these events fit themselves together, but they fitted imperfectly as yet. Santoin knew that he lacked the key. Many men could profit by possessing the contents of Santoin's safe, and might have shot Blatchford rather than let Santoin know their presence there. It was impossible for Santoin to tell which among these many the men who had been in the study might be. Who Eaton's enemies were was equally unknown to Santoin. But there could be but one man, or at most one small group of men, who could be at the same time Eaton's enemy and Santoin's. To have known who Eaton was would have pointed this man to Santoin. The blind man lay upon his back, his open, sightless eyes unwinking in the intensity of his thought. Gabriel Warden had had an appointment with a young man who had come from Asia, and who, Warden had told his wife, he had discovered lately had been greatly wronged. Eaton, under Conductor Connery's questioning, had admitted himself to be that young man. Santoin had verified this, and had learned that Eaton was, at least, the young man who had gone to Warden's house that night. But Gabriel Warden had not been allowed to help Eaton. So far from that, he had not even been allowed to meet and talk with Eaton. He had been called out plainly to prevent his meeting Eaton, and killed. Eaton disappeared and concealed himself at once after Warden's murder, apparently fearing that he would also be attacked. But Eaton was not a man whom this personal fear would have restrained from coming forward later to tell why Warden had been killed. He had been urged to come forward and promised that others would give him help in Warden's place. Still, he had concealed himself. This must mean that others than Warden could not help Eaton. Eaton evidently did not know, or else could not hope to prove, what Warden had discovered. Santoin held this thought in abeyance. He could see later how it checked with the facts. Eaton had remained in Seattle, or near Seattle, 11 days. Apparently he had been able to conceal himself and to escape attack during that time. He had been obliged, however, to reveal himself when he took the train, and as soon as possible a desperate attempt had been made against him, which, through mistake, had struck down Santoin instead of Eaton. This attack had been made under circumstances which, if it had been successful, would have made it improbable that Eaton's murderer could escape. It had not been enough, then, to watch Eaton and await opportunity to attack him. It had been necessary to attack him at once, at any cost. The attack having reached Santoin instead of Eaton, the necessity for immediate attack upon Eaton, apparently, had ceased to exist. Those who followed Eaton had thought it enough to watch him and wait for more favorable opportunity. But as soon as it was publicly known that Santoin had not been killed, but was getting well, then Eaton had again been openly and daringly attacked. The reason for the desperate chances taken to attack Eaton, then, was that he was near Santoin. Santoin's hands clenched as he recognized this. Eaton had taken the train at Seattle because Santoin was on it. He had done this at great risk to himself. Santoin had told Eaton that there were 4 possible reasons why he could have taken the train in the manner he did, and 2 of those reasons later had been eliminated. The 2 possibilities which remained were that Eaton had taken the train to inform Santoin of something, or to learn something from him. But Eaton had had ample opportunities since to inform Santoin of anything he wished, and he had not only not informed him of anything, but had refused consistently and determinedly to answer any of Santoin's questions. It was to learn something from Santoin, then, that Eaton had taken the train. The blind man turned upon his bed. He was finding that these events fitted together perfectly. He felt certain now that Eaton had gone to Gabriel Warden expecting to get from Warden some information that he needed, and that to prevent Warden's giving him this, Warden had been killed. Then Warden's death had caused Santoin to go to Seattle and take charge of many of Warden's affairs. Eaton had thought that the information which had been in Warden's possession might now be in Santoin's. Eaton, therefore, had followed Santoin onto the train. Santoin had not had the information Eaton required, and he could not even imagine yet what the nature of that information could be. This was not because he was not familiar enough with Warden's affairs. It was because he was too familiar with them. Warden had been concerned in 100 enterprises. Santoin had no way of telling which of this 100 had concerned Eaton. He certainly could recall no case in which a man of Eaton's age and class had been so terribly wronged that double murder would have been resorted to for the concealment of the facts. But he understood that, in his familiarity with Warden's affairs, he had probably been in a position to get the information, if he had known what specific matters it concerned. That, then, had been the reason why his own death would have served for the time being in place of Eaton's. Those who had followed Eaton had known that Santoin could get this information. That accounted for all that had taken place on the train. It accounted for the subsequent attack on Eaton when it became known that Santoin was getting well. It accounted also, Santoin was breathing quickly as he recognized this, for the invasion of his study and the forcing of the safe last night. The inference was plain that something which would have given Santoin the information Warden had had, and which Eaton now required, had been brought into Santoin's house and put in Santoin's safe. It was to get possession of this something before it had reached Santoin that the safe had been forced. Santoin put out a hand and pressed a bell. A servant came to the door. "Will you find Miss Santoin?" the blind man directed, "and ask her to come here?" The servant withdrew. Santoin waited. Presently the door again opened, and he heard his daughter's step. "Have you listed what was taken from the safe, Harriet?" Santoin asked. "Not yet, Father." The blind man thought an instant. "Day before yesterday, when I asked you to take charge for the present of the correspondence Avery had looked after for me, what did you do?" "I put it in my own safe, the one that was broken into last night. But none of it was taken. The bundle of letters were pulled out of the safe, but they had not been opened or even disturbed." "I know. It was not that I meant." Santoin thought again. "Harriet, something has been brought into the house, or the manner of keeping something in the house has been changed within a very few days, since the time, I think, when the attempt to run Eaton down with the motor car was made. What was that something?" His daughter reflected. "The draft of the new agreement about the Latrone properties and the lists of stockholders in the properties which came through Mr. Warden's office," she replied. Those were in the safe? Yes, you had not given me any instructions about them, so I had put them in the other safe. But when I went to get the correspondence, I saw them there and put them with the correspondence in my safe." Santoine lay still. "Who besides Donald knew that you did that, daughter?" he asked. "No one." "Thank you." Harriet recognized this as dismissal and went out. The blind man felt the blood beating fiercely in his temples and at his fingertips. It amazed, astounded him to realize that Orton's murder and all that had followed it had sprung from the Latrone case. The coupling of Orton's name with Latrone's in the newspapers after Orton's death had seemed to him only flagrant sensationalism. He himself had known, or had thought he had known, more about the Latrone case than almost any other man. He had been a witness at the trial. He had seen, or had thought he had seen, even-handed justice done there. Now, by Orton's evidence, but more still by the manner of Orton's death, he was forced to believe that there had been something unknown to him and terrible in what had been done then. And as realization of this came to him, he recollected that he had been vaguely conscious ever since Latrone's murder of something strained, something not wholly open, in his relations with those men whose interests had been most closely allied with Latrone's. It had been nothing open, nothing palpable. It was only that he had felt at times in them a knowledge of some general condition governing them which was not wholly known to himself. As he pressed his hands upon his blind eyes, trying to define this feeling to himself, his thought went swiftly back to the events on the train and in the study. He had investigated the accounts of themselves given by the passengers to Conductor Connery. Two of these accounts had proved to be false. The man who, under the name of Lawrence Hillward, had claimed the cipher telegram from Eaton had been one of these. It had proved impossible to trace this man, and it was now certain that Hillward was not his real name. The other, Santoine had had no doubt, was the heavy-set, muscular man who had tried to run Eaton down with the motor. These men, Santoine was sure, had been acting for some principle not present. One or both of these men might have been in the study last night, but the sight of neither of these could have so startled, so astounded Blatchford. Whomever Blatchford had seen was someone well known to him, whose presence had been so amazing that speech had failed Blatchford for the moment, and he had feared the effect of the announcement on Santoine. This could have been only the principal himself. Some circumstance, which Santoine comprehended only imperfectly as yet, had forced this man to come out from behind his agents and to act even at the risk of revealing himself. It was probably he who, finding Blatchford's presence made revealment inevitable, had killed Blatchford. But these circumstances gave Santoine no clue as to who the man might be. The blind man tried vainly to guess. The rebellion against his blindness, which had seized him the night before, again stirred him. The man had been in the light just before his face. A second of sight, then, and everything would have been clear. Or another word from Blatchford, and he would have known. But Santoine recalled that if he had had that second of sight, and the other man had known it, or if Blatchford had spoken that next word, Santoine, too, would probably be dead. The only circumstance regarding the man of which Santoine now felt sure was that he was one of the many concerned in the Latrone case, or with the Latrone properties. Had the blood in which Santoine had stepped upon the study floor been his, or that of one of the others? "What time is it?" the blind man suddenly asked the nurse. "It is nearly noon, Mr. Santoine, and you have eaten nothing." The blind man did not answer. He recalled vaguely that, several hours before, breakfast had been brought for him and that he had impatiently waved it away. In his absorption, he had felt no need then for food, and he felt none now. "Will you leave me alone for a few minutes?" he directed. He listened till he heard the door close behind the nurse. Then he seized the private phone beside his bed and called his broker. Instinctively, in his uncertainty, Santoin had turned to that barometer which reflects day by day, even from hour to hour, the most obscure events and the most secret knowledge. "How is the market?" he inquired. There was something approaching to a panic on the stock exchange, it appeared. Some movement, arising from causes not yet clear, had dropped the bottom out of a score of important stocks. The broker was only able to relate that, about an hour after the opening of the exchange, selling had developed in certain issues and prices were going down in complete lack of support. "How is Pacific Midlands?" Santoin asked. "It led the decline." Santoin felt the blood in his temples. "M&N Smelters?" he asked. "Down 7 points." "SF&D?" "8 points off." Santoin's hand, holding the telephone, shook in its agitation. His head was hot from the blood rushing through it. His body was chilled. An idea so strange, so astounding, so incredible, as it first had come to him that his feelings refused it through his reason, told him it was the only possible condition which could account for all the facts. Now was being made all but certain. He named stock after stock. All were down, seriously depressed, or had been supported only by a desperate effort of their chief holders. "A.L.&M is down, too," the broker volunteered. "That is only sympathetic," Santoin replied. He hung up. His hand, straining to control its agitation, reached for the bell. He rang. A servant came. "Get me notepaper," Santoin commanded. The servant went out and returned with paper. The nurse had followed him in. She turned the leaf of the bed table for Santoin to write. The blind man could write as well as any other by following the position of the lines with the fingers of his left hand. He wrote a short note swiftly now, folded, sealed, and addressed it, and handed it to the servant. "Have that delivered by a messenger at once," he directed. "There will be no written answer, I think. Only something sent back. A photograph. See that it is brought to me at once." He heard the servant's footsteps going rapidly away. He was shaking with anger, horror, resentment. He was almost, not quite, sure now of all that had taken place, of why Worden had been murdered, of what vague shape had moved behind and guided all that had happened since. He recalled Eaton's voice as he had heard it first on the train at Seattle, and now he was almost sure, not quite, that he could place that voice, that he knew where he had heard it before. He lay with clenched hands, shaking with rage. Then, by effort of his will, he put these thoughts away. The nurse reminded him again of his need for food. "I want nothing now," he said. "Have it ready when I wake up. When the doctor comes, tell him I am going to get up today and dress." He turned and stretched himself upon his bed. So, finally, he slept. End of chapter 21. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 22 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Manhunt. The rolling, ravine-gullied land where Harriet had left Eaton was wooded thickly with oaks, maples, and ash. The ground between these trees was clear of undergrowth upon the higher parts of the land, but its lower stretches and the ravines themselves were shrouded with closely growing bushes rising higher than a man's waist, and, where they grew rankest, higher than a man's head. In summer, when trees and bushes were covered with leaves, This underbrush offered cover where a man could conceal himself perfectly. Now, in the early spring, before the trees had even budded, that man would be visible for some distance by day and nearly as clearly visible by night if the headlights of the motor cars chanced to shine into the woods. Eaton, fully realizing this chance as he left Harriet, had plunged through the bushes to conceal himself in the ravine. The glare from the burning bridge lighted the ravine for only a little way. Eaton had gained the bottom of the ravine beyond the point where this light would have made him visible, and had made the best speed he could along it away from the lights and voices on the road. This speed was not very great. His stockinged feet sank to their ankles in the soft mud of the ravine, and when realizing that he was leaving a trace easily followed even by lantern light, he clambered to the steep side and tried to travel along the slope. He found his progress slower still. In the darkness he crashed, sometimes full against the tree trunks. Bushes which he could not see seized and held him, ripping and tearing at his clothes. Invisible fallen saplings tripped him, and he stepped into unseen holes which threw him headlong, so that twice he rolled clear to the bottom of the ravine with fierce, hot pains which nearly deprived him of his senses, shooting through his wounded shoulder. When he had made, as he thought, fully 3/4 of a mile in this way, and must be, allowing for the winding of the ravine, at least half a mile from the pursuers, he climbed to the brink of the bank and looked back. He was not, as he had thought, half a mile from the road. He was not 1/4 of a mile. He could still see plainly the lights of the 3 motor cars upon the road and men moving in the flare of these lights. He was certain that he had recognized the figure of Avery among these men. Pursuit of him, however, appeared to have been checked for the moment. He heard neither voices nor any movement in the woods. Eaton, panting, threw himself down to recover breath and strength to think. There was no question in Eaton's mind what his fate would be if he surrendered to or was captured by his pursuers. What he had seen in Santoine's study an hour before was so unbelievable, so completely undemonstrable, unless he himself could prove his story, that he felt that he would receive no credence. Blatchford, who had seen it in the light in the study, was dead. Santoine, who would have seen it if he had had eyes, was blind. Eaton, still almost stunned and yet wildly excited by that sight, felt only, in the mad confusion of his senses, the futility of telling what he had seen unless he were in a position to prove it. Those opposed to him would put his statement aside with the mere answer that he was lying. The most charitably inclined would think only that what he had been through had driven him insane. Besides, Eaton was not at all sure that even if he had attempted to tell what he had seen he would be allowed to tell it, or, if he attempted to surrender to the men now pursuing him, he would be allowed to surrender. Donald Avery was clearly in command of those men, and was directing the pursuit. In Avery, Eaton had recognized an instinctive enemy from the first, and now, since the polo game, he sensed vaguely in Avery something more than that. What Avery's exact position was in regard to himself, Eaton was not at all sure. But of Avery's active hostility he had received full evidence. And he knew now, though how he knew it was not plain even to himself, that Avery would not allow him to surrender, but that, if he tried to give himself up, the men under Avery's orders would shoot him down. As Eaton watched, the motor, which from its position on the road he knew must be Harriet's, backed out from the others and went away. The other motors immediately afterward were turned and followed it, but Eaton could see that they left behind them a man standing armed near to the bridge, and that other men, also armed, passed through the light as they scrambled across the ravine and gained the road on its opposite side. The motors, too, stopped at intervals and then went on. He understood that they were posting men to watch the road. He traced the motor headlights a long way through the dark. One stopped, the other went on. He remembered vaguely a house near the place where the car he watched had stopped. And understanding that where there was a house there was a telephone, he knew that the alarm must be given still more widely now. Men on all sides of him must be turning out to watch the roads. He knew they did turn out like that when the occasion demanded. These waste places bordering upon the lake to north and south of Chicago, and within easy car ride of the great city, had been the scene of many such manhunts. Hobos, gypsies, broken men thrown off by the seething city wandered through them and camped there. Startling crimes took place sometimes in these tiny wildernesses. Fugitives from the city police took refuge there and were hunted down by the local police, by armed details of the city police, by soldiers from Fort Sheridan. These fugitives might much better have stayed in the concealment of the human jungle of the city. These rolling, wooden, sandy, vacant lots, which seemed to offer refuge, in reality betrayed only into certain capture. The local police had learned the method of hunting. They had learned to watch the roads and railways to prevent escape. Eaton understood, therefore, that his own possibility of escape was very small, even if escape had been his only object. But Eaton's problem was not one of escape. It was to find those he pursued and make certain that they were captured at the same time he was. And, as he crouched panting on the damp earth, he was thinking only of that. The man at the bridge, Dibley, had told enough to let Eaton know that those whom Eaton pursued were no longer in the machine he had followed with Harriet. As Eaton had rushed out of Santoine's study after the two that he had fought there, he had seen that one of these men was supporting and helping the other. He had gained on them because of that. Then other men had appeared suddenly to give their help, and he had no longer been able to gain. But he had been close enough to see that the one they dragged along and helped into the car was that enemy whose presence in the study had so amazed him. Mad exultation had seized Eaton to know that he had seriously wounded his adversary. He knew now that the man could not have got out of the car by himself. He was too badly wounded for that. He had been taken out of the car, and the other men who were missing had him in charge. The three men who had gone on in the machine had done so for their own escape, but with the added object of misleading the pursuit. The water they had got at Dibley's had been to wash the blood from the car. And now, as Eaton recalled and realized all this, he knew where the others had left the machine. Vaguely, during the pursuit, he had sensed that Harriet was swinging their motor car in a great circle, first to the north, then west, and then to the south. 2 or 3 miles back upon the road, before they had made their turn to the south, Eaton had lost for a few moments the track of the car they had been following. He picked it up again at once, and before he could speak of it to Harriet. But now he knew at that point the car they were following had left the road, turning off onto the turf at the side and coming back onto the road 100 yards beyond. This place must be nearly due north of him. The road where he had left Harriet ran north and south. To go north he must parallel this road, but it was dangerous to move too near to it because it was guarded. The sky was covered with clouds hiding the stars. The night in the woods was intensely black except where it was lighted by the fire at the bridge. To the opposite side, a faint gray glow against the clouds, which could not be the dawn but must be the reflection of the electric lights along the public pike which followed the shore of the lake, gave Eaton inspiration. If he kept this grayness of the clouds always upon his right, he would be going north. The wound in Eaton's shoulder still welled blood each time he moved. He tore strips from the front of his shirt, knotted them together, and bound his useless left arm tightly to his side. He felt in the darkness to be sure that there was a fresh clip of cartridges in his automatic pistol. Then he started forward. For the first time now he comprehended the almost impossibility of traveling in the woods on a dark night. To try to walk swiftly was to be checked after only 2 or 3 steps by a sharp collision with some tree trunk which he could not see before he felt it, or brought to a full stop by clumps of tangled, thorny bushes which enmeshed him, or to be tripped or thrown by some inequality of the ground. When he went round any of these obstacles he lost his sense of direction and wasted minutes before he could find again the dim light against the eastern sky which gave him the compass points. As he struggled forward, impatient at these delays, he came several times upon narrow, unguarded roads, and crossed them. At other times the little wilderness which protected him changed suddenly to a well-kept lawn, where some great house with its garages and outbuildings loomed ahead, and, afraid to cross these open places, he was obliged to retrace his steps and find a way around. The distance from the bridge to the place where the 3 men he was following had got out of their motor he had thought to be about 2 miles, but when he had been traveling more than an hour, he had not yet reached it. Then suddenly he came upon the road for which he was looking. Somewhere to the east along it was the place he sought. He crouched as near to the road as he dared, and where he could look up and down it. This being a main road, was guarded. A motor car with armed men in it passed him, and presently repassed, evidently patrolling the road. Its lights showed him a man with a gun standing at the first bend of the road to the east. Eaton drew further back and moved parallel to the road, but far enough away from it to be hidden. A quarter of a mile further he found a second man. The motor car, evidently, was patrolling only to this point. Another car was on duty beyond this. As Eaton halted, this second car approached, and was halted, backed, and turned. Its headlights, as it turned, swept through the woods and revealed Eaton. The man standing in the road cried out the alarm and fired at Eaton point blank. He fired a second and third time. Eaton fled madly back into the shadow. As he did so, he heard the men crying to one another and leaping from the car and following him. He found low ground less thickly wooded and plunged along it. It was not difficult to avoid the men in the blackness of the woods. He made a wide circuit and came back again to the road further on. He could still hear for a time the sounds of the hunt on the turf. Apparently he had not yet reached the right spot. He retreated to the woods, went further along, and came back to the road, lying flat upon his face again, and waiting till some other car in passing should give him light to see. Eaton, weak and dizzy from his wounds and confused by darkness and his struggle through the woods, had no exact idea how long it had taken him to get to this place, but he knew that it could have been hardly less than 2 hours since he had left Harriet. The men he was following, therefore, had that much start of him, and this made him wild with impatience, but did not discourage him. His own wounds, Eaton understood, made his escape practically impossible, because anyone who saw him would at once challenge and detain him, and the other man was still more seriously wounded. It was not his escape that Eaton feared. It was concealment of him. The man had been taken from the car because his condition was so serious that there was no hope of hiding it. Eaton thought he must be dead. He expected to find the body concealed under dead leaves, hurriedly hidden. The night had cleared a little. To the north Eaton could see stars. Suddenly the road and the leafless bushes at its sides flashed out in the bright light of a motor car passing. Eaton strained forward. He had found the place. There was no doubt a car had turned off the road some time before and stopped there. The passing of many cars had so tracked the road that none of the men in the motors seemed to have noticed anything of significance there. But Eaton saw plainly in the soft ground at the edge of the woods the footmarks of 2 men walking one behind the other. When the car had passed, he crept forward in the dark and fingered the distinct heel and toe marks in the soft soil. For a little distance he could follow them by feeling. Then, as they led him into the edge of the woods, the ground grew harder, and he could no longer follow them in that way. It was plain to him what had occurred. Two men had got out of the car here and had lifted out and carried away a third. He knelt where he could feel the last footsteps he could detect and looked around. The gray of the electric lights to the east seemed growing, spreading. Against this lightness in the sky he could see plainly the branches of the trees. He recognized then that the grayness was the coming of the dawn. It would be only a few minutes before he could see plainly enough to follow the tracks. He drew aside into the deeper cover of some bushes to wait. The wound in his shoulder no longer bled, but the pain of it twinged him through and through. His head throbbed with the hurt there. His feet were raw and bleeding, where sharp roots and branches had cut through his socks and torn the flesh. His skin was hot and dry with fever, and his head swam. He followed impatiently the slow whitening of the east. As soon as he could make out the ground in front of him, he crept forward again to the tracks. There was not yet light enough to see any distance, but Eaton, accustomed to the darkness and bending close to the ground, could discern the footmarks even on the harder soil. They led away from the road into the woods. On the rotted leaves and twigs was a dark stain. A few steps beyond there was another. The stains had sunk into the damp ground, but were plainer on the leaves. Eaton, picking up a leaf and fingering it, knew that they were blood. So the man was not dead when he had been lifted from the car, but he had been hurt desperately, was unable to help himself, was probably dying. If there had been any hope for him, his companions would not be carrying him in this way from any chance of surgical attention. Eaton followed as the tracks led through the woods. The men had gone very slowly, carrying this heavy weight. They had been traveling, as he himself had traveled, in the dark, afraid to show a light and avoiding chance of being seen by anyone on the roads. They had been as uncertain of their road as he had been of his, but the general trend of their travel was toward the east, and this evidently was the direction in which they wished to go. They had stopped frequently to rest and had laid their burden down. Then suddenly he came to a place where plainly a longer halt had been made. The ground was trampled around the spot. When the tracks went on, they were changed in character. The two men were still carrying the third, a heavy man whose weight strained them and made their feet sink in deeply where the ground was soft. But now they were not careful how they carried him, but went forward merely as though bearing a dead weight. Now, too, no more stains appeared on the brown leaves where they had passed. Their burden no longer bled. Eaton, realizing what this meant, felt neither exultation nor surprise. He had known that the man they carried, though evidently alive when taken from the car, was dying. But now he watched the tracks more closely even than before, looking for them to show him where the men had got rid of their burden. It had grown easier to follow the tracks with the increase of the light, but the danger that he would be seen had also grown greater. He was obliged to keep to the hollows. Twice, when he ventured onto the higher ground, he saw motor cars passing at a distance, but near enough so that those in them could have seen him if they had been looking his way. Once he saw at the edge of the woods a little group of armed men. His dizziness and weakness from the loss of blood was increasing. He became confused at times and lost the tracks. He went forward slowly then, examining each clump of bushes, each heap of dead leaves, to see whether the men had hidden in them that of which he was in search. But always, when he found the tracks again, their character showed him that the men were still carrying their burden. The tracks seemed fresher now. In spite of his weakness, he was advancing much faster than the others had been able to do in the darkness and heavily laden. As near as he could tell, the men had passed just before dawn. Suddenly he came upon the pike, which ran parallel to the line of the lake, some 100 yards back from the shore. He shrank back, throwing himself upon his face in the bushes. The men evidently had crossed this pike. Full day had come, and as Eaton peered out and up and down the road, he saw no one. This road appeared unguarded. Eaton, assured no one was in sight, leaped up and crossed the road. As he reached the further side, a boy carrying a fish-pole appeared suddenly from behind some bushes. He stared at Eaton, then, terrified by Eaton's appearance, he dropped the fish-pole and fled, screaming up the road. Eaton stared dazedly after him for a fraction of an instant, then plunged into the cover. He found the tracks again and followed them dizzily. But the boy had given the alarm. Eaton heard the whirring of motors on the road, and men shouting to one another. Then he heard them beating through the bushes. The noise was at some distance. Evidently the boy in his fright and confusion had not directed the men to the exact spot where Eaton had entered the woods, or they, in their excitement, had failed to understand him. But the sounds were drawing nearer. Eaton, exhausted and dizzy, followed feverishly the footmarks on the ground. It could not be far now. The men could not have carried their burden much further than this. They must have hidden it somewhere near here. He would find it nearby, must find it before these others found him. But now he could see men moving among the tree trunks. He threw himself down among some bushes, burrowing into the dead leaves. The men passed him, one so close that Eaton could have thrown a twig and hit him. Eaton could not understand why the man did not see him, but he did not. The man stopped an instant, studying the footmarks imprinted on the earth. Evidently they had no significance for him, for he went on. When the searchers had passed out of sight, Eaton sprang up and followed the tracks again. They were distinct here, plainly printed, and he followed them easily. He could hear men all about him, out of sight but calling to one another in the woods. All at once he recoiled, throwing himself down again upon the ground. The clump of bushes hiding him ended abruptly only a few yards away. Through their bare twigs, but far below him, the sunlight twinkled mockingly at him from the surface of water. It was the lake. Eaton crept forward to the edge of the steep bluff, following the tracks. He peered over the edge. The tracks did not stop at the edge of the bluff. They went on down it. The steep sandy precipice was scarred where the men, still bearing their burden, had slipped and scrambled down it. The marks crossed the shingle 60 feet below. They were deeply imprinted in the wet sand down to the water's very edge. There they stopped. Eaton had not expected this. He stared, worn out and with his senses in confusion, and overcome by physical weakness. The sunlit water only seemed to mock and laugh at him, blue, rippling under the breeze and bearing no trail. It was quite plain what had occurred. The wet sand below was trampled by the feet of 3 or 4 men and cut by a boat's bow. They had taken the body away with them in the boat, to sink it somewhere weighted with heavy stones in the deep water? Or had it been carried away on that small, swift vessel Eaton had seen from Santoine's lawn? In either case, Eaton's search was hopeless now. But it could not be so. It must not be so. Eaton's eyes searched feverishly the shore and the lake, but there was nothing in sight upon either. He crept back from the edge of the bluff, hiding beside a fallen log, banked with dead leaves. What was it he had said to Harriet? "I will come back to you, as you have never known me before." He rehearsed the words in mockery. How would he return to her now? As he moved, a fierce hot pain from the clotted wound in his shoulder shot him through and through with agony, and the silence and darkness of unconsciousness overwhelmed him. End of chapter 22. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 23 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Not Eaton, Overton. Santoine awoke at 5 o'clock. The messenger whom he had dispatched a few hours earlier had not yet returned. The blind man felt strong and steady. He had food brought him. While he was eating it, his messenger returned. Santoine saw the man alone, and, when he had dismissed him, he sent for his daughter. Harriet had waited helplessly at the house all day. All day the house had been besieged. The newspaper men, or most of them, and the crowds of the curious could be kept off, but others, neighbors, friends of her father's, or their wives, or other members of their families, claimed their prerogative of intrusion and question in time of trouble. Many of those who thus gained admittance were unused to the flattery of reporters' questions, and from their interviews sensations continued to grow. The stranger in Santoine's house, the man whom no one knew, and who had given his name as Philip Eaton, in all the reports was proclaimed the murderer. The first reports in the papers had assailed him. The stories of the afternoon papers became a public clamor for his quick capture, trial, and execution. The newspapers had sent the idle and the sensation seekers, with the price of car fare, to the country place to join the pack roaming the woods for Eaton. Harriet, standing at a window, could see them beating through the trees beyond the house, and as she watched them, wild, hot anger against them seized her. She longed to rush out and strike them and shame them and drive them away. The village police station called her frequently on the telephone to inform her of the progress of the hunt. Twice, they told her, Eaton had been seen, but both times he had avoided capture. They made no mention of his having been fired upon. Avery, in charge of the pursuit in the field, was away all day. He came in only for a few moments at lunchtime, and then Harriet avoided him. As the day progressed, the pursuit had been systematized. The wooded spots, which were the only ones that Eaton could have reached unobserved from the places where he had been seen, had been surrounded. They were being searched carefully, one by one. Through the afternoon, Harriet kept herself informed of this search. There was no report that Eaton had been seen again, but the places where he could be grew steadily fewer. The day had grown toward dusk, when a servant brought her word that her father wished to see her. Harriet went up to him fearfully. The blind man seemed calm and quiet. A thin square packet lay on the bed beside him. He held it out to her without speaking. She snatched it in dread. The shape of the packet and the manner in which it was fastened told her it must be a photograph. "Open it," her father directed. She snapped the string and tore off the paper. She stared at it, and her breath left her. She held it and stared, sobbing now as she breathed. The photograph was of Hugh, but it showed him as she had never seen or known him. The even, direct eyes, the good brow, the little lift of the head were his. He was younger in the picture. She was seeing him when he was hardly more than a boy. But it was a boy to whom something startling, amazing, horrible had happened, numbing and dazing him so that he could only stare out from the picture in frightened, helpless defiance. That oppression which she had felt in him had just come upon him. He was not yet used to bearing what had happened. It seemed incredible and unbearable to him. She felt instinctively that he had been facing, when this picture was taken, the injustice which had changed him into the self-controlled, watchful man that she had known. So, as she contrasted this man with the boy that had been, her love and sympathy for him nearly overpowered her. She clutched the picture to her, pressed it against her cheek. Then, suddenly conscious that her emotion might be audible to her father, she quickly controlled herself. "What is it you want to know, Father?" she asked. "You have answered me already what I was going to ask, my dear," he said to her quietly. "What, Father?" "That is the picture of Eaton?" "Yes." "I thought so." She tried to assure herself of the shade of the meaning in her father's tone, but she could not. She understood that her recognition of the picture had satisfied him in regard to something over which he had been in doubt. But whether this was to work in favor of Hugh and herself, she thought of herself now inseparably with Hugh, or whether it threatened them, she could not tell. "Father, what does this mean?" she cried to him. "What, dear?" "You're having the picture. Where did you get it?" Her father made no reply. She repeated it until he granted. "I knew where it might be. I sent for it." But, Father—" It came to her now that her father must know who Hugh was. "Who?" "I know who he is now," her father said calmly. "I will tell you when I can." "When you can?" "Yes," he said. He was still an instant. She waited. "Where is Avery?" he asked her, as though his mind had gone to another subject instantly. "He has not been in, I believe, since noon." "He is overseeing the search for Eaton?" "Yes." "Send for him. Tell him I wish to see him here at the house. He is to remain within the house until I have seen him." Something in her father's tone startled and perplexed her. She thought of Donald now only as the most eager and most vindictive of Eaton's pursuers. Was her father removing Donald from among those seeking Eaton? Was he sending for him because what he had just learned was something which would make more rigorous and desperate the search? The blind man's look and manner told her nothing. "You mean Donald is to wait here until you send for him, Father?" "That is it." It was the blind man's tone of dismissal. He seemed to have forgotten the picture. At least, as his daughter moved toward the door, he gave no direction concerning it. She halted, looking back at him. She would not carry the picture away, secretly, like this. She was not ashamed of her love for Eaton, whatever might be said or thought of him. She trusted him. She was proud of her love for him. "May I take the picture?" she asked steadily. "Do whatever you want with it," her father answered quietly. And so she took it with her. She found a servant of whom she inquired for Avery. He had not returned, so she sent for him. She went down to the deserted library and waited there with the picture of Hugh in her hand. The day had drawn to dusk. She could no longer see the picture in this fading light. She could only recall it, and now, as she recalled it, the picture itself, not her memory of her father's manner in relation to it, gave her vague discomfort. She got up suddenly, switched on the light, and, holding the picture close to it, studied it. What it was in the picture that gave her this strange uneasiness, quite separate and distinct from all that she had felt when she first looked at it, she could not tell. But the more she studied it, the more troubled and frightened she grew. The picture was a plain, unretouched print pasted upon common, square cardboard, without photographer's emboss or signature, and printed with the picture were 4 plain, distinct numerals, 8253. She did not know what they meant or if they had any real significance. But somehow, now she was more afraid for Hugh than she had been. She trembled as she held the picture again to her cheek and then to her lips. She turned. Someone had come in from the hall. It was Donald. He was in riding clothes and was disheveled and dusty from leading the men on horseback through the woods. She saw at her first glance at him that his search had not yet succeeded, and she threw her head back in relief. Donald seemed to have returned without meeting the servant sent for him, and, seeing the light, he had looked into the library idly. But when he saw her, he approached her quickly. "What have you there?" he demanded of her. She flushed at the tone. "What right have you to ask?" Her instant impulse had been to conceal the picture, but that would make it seem she was ashamed of it. She held it so Donald could see it if he looked. He did look and suddenly seized the picture from her. "Don!" she cried at him. He stared at the picture and then up at her. "Where did you get this, Harriet?" "Don! Where did you get it?" he repeated. "Are you ashamed to say?" "Ashamed? Father gave it to me." "Your father?" Avery started. But if anything had caused him apprehension, it instantly disappeared. "Then didn't he tell you who this man Eaton is?" His tone terrified her, made her confused. She snatched for the picture, but he held it from her. "Didn't he tell you what this picture is?" "What?" she repeated. "What did he say to you?" "He got the picture and had me see it. He asked me if it was Mr. Eaton. I told him yes." "And then didn't he tell you who Eaton was?" Avery iterated. "What do you mean, Don?" He put the picture down on the table beside him, and, as she rushed for it, he seized both her hands and held her before him. "Harry, dear," he said to her. "Harry, dear." "Don't call me that. Don't speak to me that way." "Why not?" "I don't want you to." "Why not?" She struggled to free herself from him. "I know, of course," he said. "It's because of him." He jerked his head toward the picture on the table. The manner made her furious. "Let me go, Don." "I'm sorry, dear." He drew her to him, held her only closer. "Don, Father wants to see you. He wanted to know when you came in. He will let you know when you can go to him." "When did he tell you that?" "Just now." "When he gave you the picture?" "Yes." Avery had almost let her go. Now he held her hard again. "Then he wanted me to tell you about this Eaton." "Why should he have you tell me about Mr. Eaton?" "You know," he said to her. She shrank and turned her head away and shut her eyes, not to see him. And he was the man whom, until some strange moment a few days ago, she had supposed she was some time to marry. Amazement burned through her now at the thought, because this man had been well-looking, fairly interesting and amusing, and got on well both with her father and herself, and because he cared for her, she had supposed she could marry him. His assertion of his right to intimacy with her revolted her, and his confidence that he had ability, by something he might reveal, to take her from Eaton and bring her back within reach of himself. Or wasn't it merely that? She twisted in his arms until she could see his face and stared at him. His look and manner were full of purpose. He was using terms of endearment toward her more freely than he ever had dared to use them before, and it was not because of love for her. It was for some purpose or through some necessity of his own that he was asserting himself like this. So she ceased to struggle against him, only drawing away from him as far as she could and staring at him, prepared, before she asked her question, to deny and reject his answer no matter what it was. "What have you to say about him, Donald?" "Harry, you haven't come to really care for him. It was just madness, dear. Only a fancy, wasn't it?" "What have you to say about him?" "You must never think of him again, dear. You must forget him forever." "Why?" "Harry, Donald, I am not a child. If you have something to say which you consider hard for me to hear, tell it to me at once." "Very well. Perhaps that is best. Dear, either this man whom you have known as Eaton will never be found, or, if he is found, he cannot be let to live. You understand?" "Why?" "For the shooting of Cousin Wallace? He never did that. I don't believe that. I don't think Father believes that. You'll never make any jury believe that. So if that's all you have to tell me, let me go." She struggled again, but Avery held her. "I was not talking about that. That's not necessary, to bring that against him." "Necessary?" "No. Nor is it necessary, if he is caught, even to bring him before a jury. That's been done already, you see." "Done already?" Avery nodded again toward the photograph on the table. Yes, Harry. Have you never seen a picture with the numbers printed in below like that? Can't you guess yet where your father must have sent for that picture? Don't you know what those numbers mean? What do they mean? They are the figures of his number in what is called the Rogues' Gallery. Now, have you heard of it? Go on. They mean he has committed a crime and been tried and convicted of it. They mean in this case that he has committed a murder. A murder? For which he was convicted and sentenced. Sentenced? Yes, and is alive now only because before the sentence could be carried out, he escaped. That man, Philip Eaton, is Hugh. Hugh? Hugh Overton, Harry. Hugh Overton? Yes. I found it out today. The police have just learned it, too. I was coming to tell your father. He's Hugh Overton, the murderer of Matthew Latrone. Harriet fought herself free. Denial, revolt stormed in her. It isn't so, she cried. He is not that man. Hugh, his name is Hugh, but he is not Hugh Overton. Mr. Warden said Hugh, this Hugh, had been greatly wronged, terribly wronged. Mr. Warden tried to help Hugh even at the risk of his own life. He would not, nobody would have tried to help Hugh Overton. Mr. Warden probably had been deceived. No, no. Yes, Harry, for this man is certainly Hugh Overton. It isn't so. I know it isn't so. You mean he told you he was someone else, Harry? No, I mean... She faced him defiantly. Father let me keep the photograph. I asked him, and he said, do whatever you wish with it. He knew I meant to keep it. He knows who Hugh is, so he would not have said that if... She heard a sound behind her and turned. Her father had come into the room, and as she saw his manner and his face, she knew that what Avery had just told her was the truth. She shrank away from them. Her hands went to her face and hid it. So this was that unknown thing which had stood between herself and Hugh, that something which she had seen 100 times check the speech upon his lips and chill his manner toward her. Hadn't Hugh himself told her, or almost told her, it was something of that sort? He had said to her on the train, when she urged him to defend himself against the charge of having attacked her father, if I told them who I am, that would make them only more certain their charge is true. It would condemn me without a hearing. And his being Hugh Overton explained everything. She knew now why it was that her father, on hearing Hugh's voice, had become curious about him. He tried to place the voice in his recollection, the voice of a prisoner on trial for his life, heard only for an instant, but fixed upon his mind by the circumstances attending it, though those circumstances afterward had been forgotten. She knew why she, when she had gazed at the picture a few moments before, had been disturbed and frightened at feeling it to be a kind of picture unfamiliar to her and threatening her with something unknown and terrible. She knew the reason now for a score of things Hugh had said to her, for the way he had looked many times when she had spoken to him. It explained all that. It seemed to her, in the moment, to explain everything, except one thing. It did not explain Hugh himself, the kind of man he was, the kind of man she knew him to be, the man she loved. He could not be a murderer. Her hands dropped from her face. She threw her head back proudly and triumphantly, as she faced now both Avery and her father. He, the murderer of Mr. Latrone? She cried quietly. It isn't so. The blind man was very pale. He was fully dressed. A servant had supported him and helped him down the stairs, and still stood beside him, sustaining him. But the will which had conquered his disability of blindness was holding him firmly now against the disability of his hurts. He seemed composed and steady. She saw compassion for her in his look, and compassion, under the present circumstances, terrified her. Stronger, far more in control of him than his compassion for her, she saw purpose. She recognized that her father had come to a decision upon which he now was going to act. She knew that nothing she or anyone else could say would alter the decision, and that he would employ his every power in acting upon it. The blind man seemed to check himself an instant in the carrying out of his purpose. He turned his sightless eyes toward her. There was emotion in his look. But, except that this emotion was in part pity for her, she could not tell exactly what his look expressed. "Will you wait for me outside, Harriet?" he said to her. "I shall not be long." She hesitated. Then she felt suddenly the futility of opposing him, and she passed him and went out into the hall. The servant followed her, closing the door behind him. She stood just outside the door, listening. She heard her father. She could catch the tone. She could not make out the words. Asking a question. She heard the sound of Avery's response. She started back near the door and put her hand on it to open it. Inside they were still talking. She caught Avery's tone more clearly now, and it suddenly terrified her. She drew back from the door and shrank away. There had been no opposition to Avery in her father's tone. She was certain now that he was only discussing with Avery what they were to do. She had waited nearly half an hour, but the library door had not been opened again. The closeness of the hall seemed choking her. She went to the front door and threw it open. The evening was clear and cool, but it was not from the chill of the air that she shivered as she gazed out at the woods through which she had driven with Hugh the night before. There the hunt for him had been going on all day. There she pictured him now, in darkness, in suffering, alone, hurt, hunted, and with all the world but her against him. She ran down the steps and stood on the lawn. The vague noises of the house now no longer were audible. She stood in the silence of the evening, strained and fearfully listening. At first there seemed to be no sound outdoors other than the gentle rush of the waves on the beach at the foot of the bluff behind her. Then, in the opposite direction, she divined the undertone of some far-away confusion. Sometimes it seemed to be shouting, next only a murmur of movement and noise. She ran up the road 100 yards in its direction and halted again. The noise was nearer and clearer, a confusion of motor explosions and voices, and now one sound clattered louder and louder and leaped nearer rapidly and rose above the rest, the roar of a powerful motor car racing with cutout open. The rising racket of it terrified Harriet with its recklessness and triumph. Yes, that was it, triumph. The far-off tumult was the noise of shouts and cries of triumph. The racing car, blaring its way through the night, was the bearer of news of success of the search. Harriet went colder as she knew this. Then she ran up the road to meet the car coming. She saw the glare of its headlights through the trees past a bend in the road. She ran on, and the beams of the car's headlights straightened and glared down the road directly upon her. The car leaped at her. She ran on toward it, arms in the air. The clatter of the car became deafening, and the machine was nearly upon her when the driver recognized that the girl on the road was heedless and might throw herself before him unless he stopped. He brought his car up short and skidding. "What is it?" he cried, as he muffled the engine. "What is it? What is it?" she cried in return. The man recognized her. "Miss Santoyne." "What is it?" "We've got him!" the man cried. "We've got him." "Him?" "Him. Hugh Overton, Eaton, Miss Santoyne. He's Hugh Overton. Hadn't you heard? And we've got him. Got him." She seemed to the man not to understand, and he had not time to explain further even to her. "Where is Mr. Avery?" he demanded. "I've got to tell Mr. Avery." She made no response, but threw herself in front of the car and clasped a wheel as the man started to throw in his gear. He cried to her and tried to get her off, but she was deaf to him. He looked in the direction of the house, shut off his power, and leaped down. He left the machine and ran on the road toward the house. Harriet waited until he was away. Then she sprang to the seat. She started the car and turned it back in the direction from which it had come. She speeded, and soon other headlights flared at hers. A number of them, 4 or 5 cars at least, were in file up the road, and men were crowding and horsemen were riding beside them. The captors of Hugh were approaching in triumphal procession. Harriet felt the wild, savage impulse to hurl her racing car headlong and at full speed among them. She rushed on so close that she alarmed them. They cried a warning. The horsemen and the men on foot jumped from beside the road, and the leading car swung to one side. But Harriet caught her car on the brakes and swung it straight across the road and stopped it. She closed the throttle and pulled the key from the starting mechanism and flung it into the woods. So she sat in the car, waiting for the captors of Hugh to come up. These appreciated the hostility of her action without yet recognizing her. The motors stopped. The men on foot closed around. One of them cried her name, and men descended from the leading car. Harriet got down from her machine and met them. The madness of the moments past was gone. As the men addressed her with astonishment, but with respect, she gazed at them coolly. "Where is he?" she asked them. "Where is he?" They did not tell her, but reply was unnecessary. Other eyes pointed hers to Hugh. He was in the back seat of the second machine, with 2 men, one on each side of him. The lights from the car following and the reflections from the other lights showed him to her. He was sitting, or being held, up straight. His arms were down at his sides. She could not see whether they were tied or not. The light did not shine so as to let her see his face clearly, but his bearing was calm. He held his head up. She looked for his hurts. There seemed to be bandages on his head, but someone had given him a large cap, which was pulled down so as to conceal the bandages. Plainly there had been no other capture. Excitement was all centered upon him. Harriet heard people telling her name to others, and the newspaper men, who seemed to be all about, pushed back those who would interfere with her reaching the second machine. She disregarded them and everyone else but Hugh, who had seen her and had kept his gaze steadily upon her as she approached. She stopped at the side of the car where he was and put her hand on the edge of the tonneau. "You have been hurt again, Hugh?" she managed steadily. "Hurt? No," he said constrainedly. "No." A blinding flare and an explosion startled her about. It was only a flashlight fired by one of the newspaper photographers who had placed his camera during the halt. Harriet opened the door to the tonneau. 2 men occupied the seats in the middle of the car. It was a large 7-passenger machine. "I will take this seat, please," she said to the man near her. He got out and she sat down. Those who had been trying to start the car which she had driven across the road had given up the task and were pushing it away to one side. Harriet sat down in front of Eaton. It was still by that name she thought of him. Her feelings refused the other name, though she knew now it was his real one. She understood now her impulse, which had driven her to try to block the road to her father's house, if only for a moment. They were taking him there to deliver him up to Avery, to her father, who were consulting there over what his fate was to be. She put her hand on his. His fingers closed upon it, but after his first response to her grasp, he made no other. And now, as the light showed him to her more clearly, she was terrified to see how unable he was to defend himself against anything that might be done to him. His calmness was the calmness of exhaustion. His left arm was bound tightly to his side. His eyes, dim and blank, with pain and weariness, stared only dully, dazedly all around. The car started, and she sat silent, with her hand still upon his, as they went on to her father's house. End of chapter 23. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 24 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Flaw in the Left Eye. Santoine, after Harriet had left the library, stood waiting until he heard the servant go out and close the door. He had instructed the man and another with him to remain in the hall. The blind man felt no physical weakness. He was wholly absorbed in the purpose for which he had dressed and come downstairs. Now, as he heard Avery start forward to help him, he motioned him back. It was the rule in Santoine's house that the furniture in the rooms he frequented should be kept always in the same positions. The blind man could move about freely, therefore, in these rooms. He walked slowly now to a large chair beside the table in the center of the room and sat down, resting his arm on the table. When he felt the familiar smoothness of the table under his fingertips, he knew he was facing the part of the room where the sound he had just heard had told him Avery must be. "When did you learn that Eaton was Hugh Overton, Avery?" he asked. "Today." "How did you discover it?" He heard Avery, who had been standing, come forward and seat himself on the arm of the chair across the table from him. The blind man turned to face this place directly. "It was plain from the first there was something wrong with the man," Avery replied. "But I had, of course, no way of placing him until he gave himself away at polo the other day." "At polo? Then you knew about it the other day?" "Oh, no," Avery denied. "I saw that he was pretending not to know a game which he did know. When he put over one particular stroke, I was sure he knew the game very well. The number of men in this country who've played polo at all isn't very large, and those who can play great polo are very few. So I sent for the polo annuals for a few years back. The ones I wanted came to the club today. His picture is in the group of the Spring Meadows Club. He played back for them 5 years ago. His name was under the picture, of course." "You didn't tell me, however, that he could play polo when you first found it out." "No, I wanted to be sure of him before I spoke. Besides, Harriet had seen it as well as I. I suppose she had told you." "I understand. I'm glad to know how it was. One less certain of your fidelity than I am might have put another construction on your silence. One less certain, Avery, might have thought that, already knowing Eaton's identity, you preferred instead of telling it to me to have me discover it for myself, and so, for that reason, you trapped him into a polo game in Harriet's presence. I myself did not think that. The other possibility which might occur to one not certain of your fidelity we will not now discuss." For a moment Santoine paused. The man across from him did not speak, but, Santoine's intuition told him, drew himself suddenly together against some shock. The blind man felt that Avery was watching him now with tense questioning. "Of course," said Santoine, "knowing who Eaton is gives us no aid in determining who the men were that fought with him in my study last night." "It gives none to me, Mr. Santoine," Avery said steadily. "It gives none to you," Santoine repeated. "And the very peculiar behavior of the stock exchange today, I suppose that gives you no help either. All day they have been going down, Avery. The securities, the stocks and bonds of the properties still known as the Latrone properties. The very securities which 5 years ago stood staunch against even the shock of the death of the man whose coarse but powerful personality had built them up into the great properties they are today. of Matthew Latrone's death. Today, without apparent reason, they have been going down, and that gives you no help either, Avery." "I'm afraid I don't follow you, sir." "Yet you are a very clever man, Avery. There's no question about that. Your friend and my friend who sent you to me 5 years ago was quite correct in calling you clever. I have found you so. I have been willing to pay you a good salary, a very good salary, because you are clever." "I'm glad if you have found my work satisfactory, Mr. Santoin. I have even found it worth while at times to talk over with you matters, problems, which were troubling me, to consult with you, have I not?" "Yes." "Very well. I'm going to consult with you now. I have an infirmity, as you know, Avery. I am blind. I have just found out that for several years, for about 5 years, to be exact, that is, for about the same length of time that you have been with me, my blindness has been used by a certain group of men to make me the agent of a monstrous and terrible injustice to an innocent man. Except for my blindness, except for that, Avery, this injustice never could have been carried on. If you find a certain amount of bitterness in my tone, it is due to that. A man who has an infirmity, Avery, cannot well help being a little sensitive in regard to it. You are willing I should consult with you in regard to this?" "Of course, I'm at your service, Mr. Santoin." Avery's voice was harsh and dry. The blind man was silent for an instant. He could feel the uneasiness and anxiety of the man across from him mounting swiftly, and he gave it every opportunity to increase. He had told Eaton once that he did not use cat-and-mouse methods. He was using them now because that was the only way his purpose could be achieved. "We must go back, then, Avery, to the quite serious emergency to which I am indebted for your faithful service. It is fairly difficult now for one contemplating the reverence and regard in which big men are held by the public in these days of business reconstruction, to recall the attitude of only a few years ago. However, it is certainly true that 5 years ago the American people appeared perfectly convinced that the only way to win true happiness and perpetuate prosperity was to accuse, condemn, and jail for life, if execution were not legal, the heads of the important groups of industrial properties. Just at that time, one of these men, one of the most efficient, but also, perhaps, the one personally most obnoxious or unpopular, committed one of his gravest indiscretions. It concerned the private use of deposits in national banks. It was a federal offense of the most patent and provable kind. He was indicted. Considering the temper of any possible jury at the time, there was absolutely no alternative but to believe the man under indictment must spend many succeeding years, if not the rest of his life, in the federal penitentiary at Atlanta or Leavenworth. Now, not only the man himself, but his closest associates contemplated this certainty with dismay. The man was in complete control of a group of the most valuable and prosperous properties in America. Before his gaining control, the properties had been almost ruined by differences between the minor men who tried to run them. Only the calling of Matthew Latrone into control saved these men from themselves. They required him to govern them. His taking away would bring chaos and ruin among them again. They knew that. There were a number of important people, therefore, who held hope against hope that Latrone would not be confined in a prison cell. Just before he must go to trial, Latrone himself became convinced that he faced confinement for the rest of his life. Then fate effectively intervened to end all his troubles. His body, charred and almost consumed by flames, but nevertheless the identified body of Matthew Latrone, was found in the smoking ruins of his shooting lodge, which burned to the ground 2 days before his trial. I have stated correctly these particulars, have I not, Avery?" "Yes." Avery was no longer sitting on the arm of the chair. He had slipped into the seat. He was hunched in the seat, watching the blind man with growing conviction and fear. "There were, of course," Santoin went on, "many of the violent and passion-inflamed who carped at this timely intervention of fate and criticized the accident which delivered Latrone at this time. But these were silenced when Latrone's death was shown to have been, not accident, but murder. A young man was shown to have followed Latrone to the shooting lodge. A witness appeared who had seen this young man shoot Latrone. A second witness had seen him set fire to the lodge. The young man, Hugh Overton, was put on trial for his life. I myself, as a witness at the trial, supplied the motive for the crime, for, though I had never met Overton, I knew that he had lost the whole of a large fortune through investments recommended to him by Latrone. Overton was convicted, sentenced to death. He escaped before the sentence was carried out, became a fugitive without a name, who, if he ever reappeared, would be handed over for execution. For the evidence had been perfect, complete. He had shot Latrone purely for revenge, killed him in the most despicable manner, for there was no doubt Latrone was dead. Was there, Avery?" Santoin waited for reply. "What?" Avery said huskily. "I said there was no doubt Latrone was dead?" "None. That was the time you came into my employ, Avery, recommended to me by one of the men who had been closest to Latrone. I was not connected with the Latrone properties except as an adviser, but many papers relating to them must go inevitably through my hands. I was rather on the inside in all that concerned those properties. But I could not myself see the papers. I was blind. Therefore, I had to have others serve as eyes for me. And from the first, Avery, you served as my eyes in connection with all papers relating to the Latrone properties. If anything ever appeared in those papers which might have led me to suspect that an injustice had been done in the punishment of Latrone's murderer, it could reach me only through you. Nothing of that sort ever did reach me, Avery. You must have made quite a good thing out of it. What? I say, your position here must have been rather profitable to you, Avery. I have not treated you badly myself, recognizing that you must often be tempted by gaining information here from which you might make money, and your other employers must have overbid me. I don't understand. I beg your pardon, Mr. Santoin, but I do not follow what you are talking about. No? Then we must go a little further. This last year a minor reorganization became necessary in some of the Latrone properties. My friend Gabriel Warden, who was an honest man, Avery, had recently greatly increased his interest in those properties. It was inevitable that the reorganization should be largely in his hands. I remember now there was opposition to his share in it. The fact made no impression on me at the time. Opposition is common in all things. During his work with the Latrone properties, Warden, the honest man, Avery, discovered the terrible injustice of which I speak. I suspect there were discrepancies in the lists of stockholders, showing a concealed ownership of considerable blocks of stock, which first excited his suspicions. Whatever it may have been, Warden certainly investigated further. His investigation revealed to him the full particulars of the injustice done to the nameless fugitive who had been convicted as the murderer of Matthew Latrone. Evidently this helpless, hopeless man had been thought worth watching by someone, for Warden's discoveries gave him also Overton's address. Warden risked and lost his life trying to help Overton. I do not need to draw your attention, Avery, to the very peculiar condition which followed Warden's death. Warden had certainly had communication with Overton of some sort. Overton's enemies, therefore, were unable to rid themselves of him by delivering him up to the police because they did not know how much Overton knew. When I found that Warden had made me his executor, and I went west and took charge of his affairs, their difficulties were intensified, for they did not dare to let suspicion of what had been done reach me. There was no course open to them, therefore, but to remove Overton before my suspicions were aroused, even if it could be done only at desperate risk to themselves. What I'm leading up to, Avery, is your own connection with these events. You looked after your own interests rather carefully, I think, up to a certain point. When, knowing who Eaton was, you got him into a polo game, it was so that, if your interests were best served by exposing him, you could do so without revealing the real source of your knowledge of him. But an unforeseen event arose. The drafts and lists related to the reorganization of the Latrone properties, containing the very facts, no doubt, which first had aroused Warden's suspicions, were sent me through Warden's office. At first there was nothing threatening to you in this, because their contents could reach me only through you. But in the uncertainty I felt, I had my daughter take these matters out of your hands. You did not dare then even to ask me to give them back, for fear that would draw my attention to them and to you. That night, Avery, you sent an unsigned telegram from the office in the village. Almost within 24 hours my study was entered. The safe inaccessible to you was broken open. The contents were carried away. The study window had not been forced. It had been left open from within. Do you suppose I do not know that one of the two men in the study last night was the principal whose agents had failed in 2 attempts to get rid of Overton for him? Whose other agent, yourself, Avery, had failed to intercept the evidence which would have revealed the truth to me, so that, no longer trusting to agents, he himself had come in desperation to prevent my learning the facts? I realize fully, Avery, that by means of you my blindness and my reputation have been used for 5 years to conceal from the public the fact that Matthew Latrone had not been murdered, but was still alive. The blind man halted. He had not gone through this long conversation, with all the strain that it entailed upon himself, without a definite object. And now, as he listened to Avery's quick breathing and the nervous tapping of his fingers against the arm of his chair, he realized that this object was accomplished. Avery not only realized that the end of deception and concealment had come, he recognized thoroughly that Santoine would not have spoken until he had certain proof to back his words. Avery might believe that, as yet, the blind man had not all the proof in his possession, but Avery knew, as he was aware that Santoine also knew, that exposure threatened so many men that some one of them now was certain to come forward to save himself at the expense of the others, and Avery knew that only one, and the first one so to come forward, could be saved. So Santoine heard Avery now get up. He stood an instant and tried to speak, but his breath caught nervously. He made another effort. "I don't think you have much against me, Mr. Santoine," he managed. It was, as the blind man had expected, only of himself that Avery was thinking. "No?" Santoine asked quietly. "I didn't have anything to do with convicting Overton, or know anything about it until that part was all over. I never saw him till I saw him on the train. I didn't know Warden was going to be killed." "But you were accessory to the robbery of my house last night, and, therefore, accessory to the murder of Wallace Blatchford." Last night, too, knowing Overton was innocent of everything charged against him, you gave orders to fire upon him at sight, and he was fired upon. And what were you telling Harriet when I came in? You have told the police that Overton is the murderer of Latrone. Isn't that so the police will refuse to believe anything he may say and return him to the death cell for the sentence to be executed upon him? The law will call these things attempted murder, Avery." The blind man heard Avery pacing the floor, and then heard him stop in front of him. "What is it you want of me, Mr. Santoyne?" "The little information I still require." "You mean you want me to sell the crowd out?" "Not that, because I offer you nothing. A number of men are going to the gallows or the penitentiary for this, Avery, and you, I suspect, among them, though I also suspect, from what I have learned about your character in the last few days, that you'll take any means open to you to avoid sharing their fate." "I suppose you mean by that I'll turn state's evidence if I get a chance, and that I might as well begin now." "That, I should say, is entirely up to you. The charge, of what I know, with the simultaneous arrest of a certain number of men in different places whom I know must be implicated, will be made tomorrow. You, perhaps, are a better judge than I of the cohesion of your group in the contingencies which it will face tomorrow morning. I offer you nothing now, Avery. No recommendation of clemency, nothing. If you prefer to have me learn the full facts from the first of another who breaks, very well." Santoyne waited. He heard Avery take a few more steps up and down. Then he halted. Now he walked again. They were uneven steps as Santoyne heard them. Then Avery stopped once more. "What is it you want to know, sir?" "Who killed Warden?" "John Yarrow is his name. He was a sort of hanger-on of Latrone's. I don't know where Latrone picked him up." "Was it he who also made the attack on the train?" "Yes." "Who was the other man on the train? The one that claimed the telegram addressed to Lawrence Hillward?" "His name's Hollick. He's the titular owner of the place on the Michigan shore where Latrone has been living. The telegram I sent night before last was addressed to his place. You know, he's been a sort of go-between for Latrone and the men, those who knew, who were managing the properties. I'd never met him, though, Mr. Santoyne, and I didn't know either him or Hollick on the train. As I said, I wasn't in the know about killing Warden." "When did you learn who Eaton was, Avery?" "The day after we got back here from the West I got word from Latrone. They didn't tell me till they needed to use me." Avery hesitated. Then he went on. He was eager now to tell all he knew in his belief that by doing so he was helping his own case. "You understand, sir, about Latrone's pretended death. A guide at the shooting lodge had been killed by a chance shot in the woods, purely accidental. Someone of the party had fired at a deer, missed, and never knew he killed a man with the waist shot. When the guide didn't come back to camp, they looked for him and found his body. He was a man who never would be missed or inquired for, and was very nearly Latrone's size, and that gave Latrone the idea. At first there was no idea of pretending he had been murdered. It was the coroner who first suggested that. Things looked ugly for a while, under the circumstances, as they were made public. Either the scheme might come out, or someone else be charged as the murderer. That put it up to Overton. He had actually been up there to see Latrone and had had a scene with him which had been witnessed. That part, all but the evidence which showed that he shot Latrone afterwards, was perfectly true. He thought that Latrone, as he was about to go to trial, might be willing to give him information which would let him save something from the fortune he'd lost through Latrone's manipulations. The circumstances, motive, everything was ready to convict Overton. It needed very little more to complete the case against him. So it was completed. But after Overton was convicted, he was not allowed to be punished, sir." Santoine's lips straightened in contempt. "He was not allowed to be punished?" "Overton didn't actually escape, you know, Mr. Santoine. That is, he couldn't have escaped without help. Latrone was thoroughly frightened, and he wanted it carried through and Overton executed. But some of the others rebelled against this and saw that Overton got away, but he never knew he'd been helped. I understand it was evidence of Latrone's insistence on the sentence being carried out that Warden found, after his first suspicions had been aroused, and that put Warden in a position to have Latrone tried for his life, and made it necessary to kill Warden. Latrone is dead, of course, Avery, or fatally wounded?" "He's dead. Eaton, that is, sir, hit him last night with 3 shots." "As a housebreaker engaged in rifling my safe, Avery?" "Yes, sir. Latrone was dying when they took him out of the car last night. They got him away, though, put him on the boat he'd come on. I saw them in the woods last night. They'll not destroy the body or make away with it, sir, at present." "In other words, you instructed them not to do so until you had found out whether Overton could be handed over for execution and the facts regarding Latrone kept secret, or whether some other course was necessary." The blind man did not wait for any answer to this. He straightened suddenly, gripping the arms of his chair, and got up. There was more he wished to ask. In the bitterness he felt at his blindness having been used to make him an unconscious agent in these things of which Avery spoke so calmly, he was resolved that no one who had shared knowingly in them should go unpunished. But now he heard the noise made by approach of Eaton's captors. He had noted it a minute or more earlier. He was sure now that it was definitely nearing the house. He crossed to the window, opened it, and stood there listening. The people outside were coming up the driveway. Santoine went into the hall. "Where is Miss Santoine?" he inquired. The servant who waited in the hall told him she had gone out. As Santoine stood listening, the sounds without became coherent to him. "They have taken Overton, Avery," he commented. "Of course they have taken no one else. I shall tell those in charge of him that he is not the one they are to hold prisoner, but that I have another for them here." The blind man heard no answer from Avery. Those having Overton in charge seemed to be coming into the house. The door opened, and there were confused sounds. Santoine stood separating the voices. "What is it?" he asked the servant. "Mr. Eaton, Mr. Overton, sir, fainted as they were taking him out of the motor car, sir. He seems much done up, sir." Santoine recognized that 4 or 5 men, holding or carrying their prisoner between them, had come in and halted in surprise at sight of him. "We have him!" he heard one of them cry importantly to him. "We have him, sir, and he's Hugh Overton, who killed Latrone." Then Santoine heard his daughter's voice in a half-cry, half-sob of hopeless appeal to him. Harriet ran to him. He felt her cold, trembling fingers clasping him and beseeching him. "Father! Father! They say, they will—" He put his hands over hers, clasping hers and patting it. "My dear," he said, "I thought you would wait for me. I told you to wait." He heard others coming into the house now, and he held his daughter beside him as he faced them. "Who is in charge here?" he demanded. The voice of one of those who had just come in answered him. "I, sir. I am the chief of police. I wish to speak to you. I will not keep you long. May I ask you to have your prisoner taken to the room he occupied here in my house and given attention by a doctor?" You can have my word that it is not necessary to guard him." "Wait, wait," he directed as he heard exclamations and ejaculations to correct him. "I do not mean that you have mistaken who he is. He is Hugh Overton. I know. It is because he is Hugh Overton that I say what I do." Santoin abandoned effort to separate and comprehend or to try to answer the confusion of charge and questioning around him. He concerned himself at that moment only with his daughter. He drew her to him, held her, and said gently, "There, dear, there. Everything is right. I have not been able to explain to you, and I cannot take time now. But you, at least, will take my word that you have nothing to fear for him. Nothing." He heard her gasp with incredulity and surprise. Then, as she drew back from him, staring at him, she breathed deep with relief and clasped him, sobbing. He still held her, as the hall was cleared and the footsteps of those carrying Overton went up the stairs. Then, knowing that she wished to follow them, he released her. She drew away, then clasped his hand and kissed it. As she did so, she suddenly stiffened, and her hand tightened on his spasmodically. Someone else had come into the hall, and he heard another voice, a woman's, which he recognized as that of the stenographer, Miss Davis. "Where is he? Hugh! Hugh! What have you done to him? Mr. Santoin! Mr. Santoin, where is he?" The blind man straightened, holding his daughter to him. There was anxiety, horror, love in the voice he heard. Harriet's perplexity was great as his own. "Is that you, Miss Davis?" he inquired. "Yes, yes," the girl repeated. "Where is Hugh, Mr. Santoin?" "You do not understand," the voice of a young man, anxious and straining now, but of pleasing timbre, broke in on them. "I'm afraid I don't," Santoin said quietly. "She is Hugh's sister, Mr. Santoin. She is Edith Overton." "Edith Overton? And who are you?" "You do not know me. My name is Lawrence Hillward." Santoin asked nothing more for the moment. His daughter had left his side. He stood an instant listening to the confusion of question and answer in the hall. Then he opened the door into the library and held it for the police chief to enter. End of chapter 24. Read by Tom Penn. Chapter 25 of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "It's all right, Hugh." At last. Eaton, he still, with the habit of 5 years of concealment, even thought of himself by that name, awoke to full consciousness at 8 o'clock the next morning. He was in the room he had occupied before in Santoin's house. The sunlight, reflected from the lake, was playing on the ceiling. His wounds had been dressed, his body was comfortable and without fever. He had indistinct memories of being carried, of people bending over him, of being cared for, but of all else that had happened since his capture he knew nothing. He saw and recognized, against the lighted square of the window, a man standing looking out at the lake. "Lawrence," he said. The man turned and came toward the bed. "Yes, Hugh." Eaton raised himself excitedly upon his pillows. "Lawrence, that was he, last night, in the study. It was Latrone. I saw him. You'll believe me, Lawrence. You, at least, will. They got away on a boat. They must be followed." With the first return of consciousness, he had taken up again that battle against circumstances which had been his only thought for 5 years. But now, suddenly, he was aware that his sister was also in the room. Sitting upon the opposite side of the bed, her hand came forward and clasped his. She bent over him, holding him and fondling him. "It is all right, Hugh," she whispered. "Oh, Hugh, it is all right now." "All right?" he questioned dazedly. "Yes, Mr. Santoin knows. He was not what we thought him. He believed all the while that you were justly sentenced. Now he knows otherwise." "He, Santoine, believed that?" Eaton asked incredulously. "Yes, he says his blindness was used by them to make him think so. So now he is very angry. He says no one who had anything to do with it shall escape. He figured it all out, most wonderfully, that it must have been Latrone in the study. He has been working all night. They have already made several arrests, and every port on the lake is being watched for the boat they got away on." "Is that true, Edith? Lawrence, is it true?" "Yes, quite true, Hugh." Hillward choked and turned away. Eaton sank back against his pillows, his eyes, dry, bright, and filled still with questioning for a time, as he tried to appreciate what he just had heard and all that it meant to him, dampened suddenly as he realized it was over now, that long struggle to clear his name from the charge of murder, the fight which had seemed so hopeless. He could not realize it to the full as yet. Concealment, fear, the sense of monstrous injustice done him had marked so deeply all his thoughts and feelings that he could not sense the fact that they were gone for good. So what came to him most strongly now was only realization that he had been set right with Santoine. Santoine, whom he himself had misjudged and mistrusted. And Harriet? He had not needed to be set right with her. She had believed and trusted him from the first, in spite of all that had seemed against him. Gratitude warmed him as he thought of her, and that other feeling, deeper, stronger far than gratitude, or than anything else he had ever felt toward anyone but her, surged up in him and set his pulses wildly beating as his thought strained toward the future. "Where is Miss Santoine?" he asked. His sister answered. "She has been helping her father. They left word they were to be sent for as soon as you woke up, and I've just sent for them." Eaton lay silent till he heard them coming. The blind man was unfamiliar with this room. His daughter let him in. Her eyes were very bright. Her cheeks, which had been pale, flushed as she met Eaton's look. But she did not look away. He kept his gaze upon her. Santoine, under her guidance, took the chair Hillward set beside the bed for him. The blind man was very quiet. He felt for and found Eaton's hand and pressed it. Eaton choked as he returned the pressure. Then Santoine released him. "Who else is here?" the blind man asked his daughter. "Miss Overton and Mr. Hillward," she answered. Santoine found with his blind eyes their positions in the room and acknowledged their presence. Afterward he turned back to Eaton. "I understand, I think, everything now, except some few particulars regarding yourself," he said. "Will you tell me those?" "You mean," Eaton spoke to Santoine, but he looked at Harriet. "Oh, I understand, I think. When I escaped, Mr. Santoine, of course, my picture had appeared in all the newspapers, and I was not safe from recognition anywhere in this country. I got into Canada, and from Vancouver went to China. I had very little money left, Mr. Santoine. What had not been lost through Latrone had been spent in my defense. I got a position in a mercantile house over there. It was a good country for me. People over there don't ask questions for fear someone will ask questions about them. We had no near relatives for Edith to go to, and she had to take up stenography to support herself and change her name, Mr. Santoine, because of me." Eaton's hand went out and clasped his sister's. "Oh, Hugh, it didn't matter. About me, I mean," she whispered. "Hillward met her and asked her to marry him, and she wouldn't consent without telling him who she was. He, Lawrence, believed her when she said I hadn't killed Latrone, and he suggested that she come out here and try to get employed by you.
We didn't suspect, of course, that Latrone was still alive. We thought he had been killed by some of his own crowd, in some quarrel or because his trial was likely to involve someone else so seriously that they killed him to prevent it, and that it was put upon me to protect that person, and that you—"
Eaton hesitated. "Go on," said Santoyne. "You thought I knew who Latrone's murderer was, and morally, though not technically, perjured myself at your trial to convict you in his place. What next?"
"That was it,"
Eaton assented.
"We thought you knew that, and that some of those around you who served as your eyes must know it, too."
Harriet gasped. Eaton, looking at her, knew that she understood now what had come between them, when she had told him that she herself had served as her father's eyes all through the Latrone trial. He felt himself flushing as he looked at her. He could not understand now how he could have believed that she had aided in concealing an injustice against him, no matter what influence had been exerted upon her. She was all good, all true.
"At first," Eaton went on, "Edith did not find out anything. Then, this year, she learned that there was to be a reorganization of some of the Latrone properties. We hoped that, during that, something would come out which might help us. I had been away almost 5 years. My face was forgotten, and we thought I could take the chance of coming back to be near at hand so I could act if anything did come out. Lawrence met me at Vancouver. We were about to start east when I received a message from Mr. Warden. I did not know Warden, and I don't know now how he knew who I was or where he could reach me. His message merely said he knew I needed help and he was prepared to give it, and made an appointment for me to see him at his house. He was one of the Latrone crowd, but, I found out, one of those least likely to have had a hand in my conviction. I thought possibly Warden was going to tell me the name of Latrone's murderer, and I decided to take the risk of seeing him. You know what happened when I tried to keep the appointment. Then you came to Seattle and took charge of Warden's affairs. I felt certain that if there was any evidence among Warden's effects as to who killed Latrone, you would take it back with you with the other matters relating to the Latrone reorganization. You could not recognize me from your having been at my trial because you were blind. I decided to take the train with you and try to get possession of the draft of the reorganization agreement and the other documents with it which Warden had been working on. I had suspected that I was being watched by agents of the men protecting Latrone's murderer while I was in Seattle. I had changed my lodgings there because of that, but Lawrence had remained at the old lodgings to find out for me. He found there was a man following me who disappeared after I had taken the train, and Lawrence, after questioning the gateman at Seattle, decided the man had taken the same train as I did. He wired me in the cipher we had sometimes used in communicating with each other, but not knowing what name I was using on the train, he addressed it to himself, confident that if a telegram reached the train addressed to Lawrence Hillward, I would understand and claim it. Of course, I could not follow his instructions and leave the train. We were snowed in. Besides, I could not imagine how anybody could have followed me onto the train, as I had taken pains to prevent that very thing by being the last passenger to get aboard it.
The man whom the gateman saw did not follow you. He merely watched you get on the train and notified 2 others, who took the train at Spokane. They had planned to get rid of you after you left Seattle, so as to run less risk of your death being connected with that of Warden. It was my presence which made it necessary for them to make the desperate attempt to kill you on the train.
Then I understand. The other telegram was sent me, of course, by Edith from Chicago, when she learned here that you were using the name of Dorn on your way home. I learned from her, when I got here, that the documents relating to the Latrone properties, which I had decided you did not have with you, were being sent you through Warden's office. Through Edith, I learned that they had reached you and had been put in the safe. I managed to communicate with Hilward at the country club, and that night he brought me the means of forcing the safe."
Eaton felt himself flushing again as he looked at Harriet. Did she resent his having used her in that way? He saw only sympathy in her face. "My daughter told me that she helped you to that extent," Santoin offered, "and I understood later what must have been your reason for asking her to take you out that night."
"When I reached the study," Eaton continued, "I found others already there. The light of an electric torch flashed in the face of one of them, and I recognized the man as Latrone, the man for whose murder I had been convicted and sentenced. Edith tells me that you know the rest."
There was silence in the room for several minutes. Santoin again felt for Eaton's hand and pressed it. "We've tired you out," he said. "You must rest." "You must sleep, Hugh, if you can," Edith urged. Eaton obediently closed his eyes, but opened them at once to look for Harriet. She had moved out of his line of vision. Santoin rose. He stood an instant waiting for his daughter. Then suddenly he comprehended that she was no longer in the room. "Mr. Hilward, I must ask for your help," he said, and he went out with Hilward guiding him. Eaton, turning anxiously on his pillow and looking about the room, saw no one but his sister. He had known when Harriet moved away from beside the bed, but he had not suspected that she was leaving the room. Now, suddenly, a great fear filled him.
"Why did Miss Santoin go away? Why did she go, Edith?"
he questioned.
"You must sleep, Hugh,"
his sister answered only. Harriet, when she slipped out of the room, had gone downstairs. She could not have forced herself to leave before she had heard Hugh's story, and she could not define definitely, even to herself, what the feeling had been that had made her leave as soon as he had finished. But she sensed the reason vaguely. Hugh had told her 2 days before, "I will come back to you as you have never known me yet," and it had proved true. She had known him as a man in fear, constrained, carefully guarding himself against others and against betrayal by himself, a man to whom all the world seemed opposed, so that her sympathy, and afterward something more than her sympathy, had gone out to him. To that repressed and threatened man she had told all she felt toward him, revealing her feelings with a frankness that would have been impossible except that she wanted him to know that she was ready to stand against the world with him. Now the world was no longer against him. He had friends. A place in life was ready to receive him. He would be sought after, and his name would be among those of the people of her own sort. She had no shame that she had let him, and others, know all that she felt toward him. She gloried still in it, only now, if he wished her, he must make that plain. She could not, of herself, return to him. So unrest possessed her, and the suspense of something hoped for, but unfulfilled. She went from room to room, trying to absorb herself on her daily duties. But the house, her father's house, spoke to her now only of Hugh, and she could think of nothing but him. Was he awake? Was he sleeping? Was he thinking of her? Or, now that the danger was over through which she had served him, were his thoughts of someone else? Her heart halted at each recurrence of that thought, and again she repeated his words to her at parting from her the night before. "I will come back to you as you have never known me yet." To her he would come back, he said, to her, not to anyone else. But his danger was not over then. In his great extremity and in his need for her, he might have felt what he did not feel now. If he wanted her, why did he not send for her? She stood trembling as she saw Edith Overton in the hall.
"Hugh has been asking for you continually, Miss Santoin. If you can find time, please go in and see him."
Harriet did not know what answer she made. She went upstairs. She ran as soon as she was out of sight of Hugh's sister. Then at Hugh's door, she had to halt to catch her breath and compose herself before she opened the door and looked in upon him. He was alone and seemed asleep, at least his eyes were closed. Harriet stood an instant gazing at him. His face was peaceful now, but worn, and his paleness was more evident than when he had been talking to her father. As she stood watching him, she felt her blood coursing through her as never before and warming her face and her fingertips. And fear of him or of herself, fear of anything at all in the world, fled from her, and love which she knew that she need no longer try to deny, possessed her. "Harriet!" She heard her name from his lips, and she saw, as he opened his eyes and turned to her, there was no surprise in his look. If he had been sleeping, he had been dreaming she was there. If awake, he had been thinking of her. "What is it, Hugh?" She was beside him, and he was looking up into her eyes.
"You meant it, then?"
"Meant it, Hugh?"
"All you said and all you did when you and I, were alone against them all? It's so, Harriet. You meant it?"
"And you did too, dear. It was only to me that you could come back. Only to me?"
"Only to you."
He closed his eyes in his exultation.
"Oh, my dear, I never dreamed.
Harriet, in all the days and nights I've had to plan and wonder what might be for me if everything could come out all right, I've never dreamed I could win a reward like this." "Like this?" He opened his eyes again and drew her down toward him.
"Like you."
She bent until her cheek touched his, and his arms were about her. He felt her tears upon his face.
"Not that. Not that. You mustn't cry, dear," he begged. "Oh, Harriet, aren't you happy now?"
"That's why. Happy. I didn't know before there could be anything like this."
"Nor I. So it's all right, Harriet? Everything is all right now?"
"All right? Oh, it's all right now, if I can make it so for you," she answered.
The End. End of chapter 25. Read by Tom Penn. End of The Blind Man's Eyes by William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer.